Welcome back, brothers, to Warhammer. Tonight we're diving into new lore surrounding the return of Fulgrim. Before we get into the madness, be sure to like, comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. If you want to support the channel, be sure to check out the merch in the description below. Now, let's get into the video.
There are ages in which the galaxy howls its pain so loudly that even the deaf priesthoods of terror are forced to look up from their ledgers and litanies. There are ages in which a Primarch returns in fire and proclamation, in torchlight and fanatic hymn, and the Imperium, though broken, blooded and half-mad from its own endless martyrdom, is at least granted the shape of a miracle to cling to. Then there are other ages, fouler ages, in which dread enters not as a clarion, but as a perfume. It seeps beneath sealed doors. It clings to parchments in archive vaults, and to the robes of astropaths writhing in their trance thrones. It stains the margins of reports already marked for suppression. It is felt first not by the great, but by the exhausted, by captains who have fought too long, by confessors whose faith has become a duty rather than a fire, by remembrancers of the dead who look upon fresh lists of the lost and realize, with the cold certainty of a blade laid against the throat, that history has begun to circle back upon one of its oldest wounds. The Imperium has endured the return of legends and paid for each one in blood. It has seen ancient sons of the Emperor stride from myth into the choking present, and has dressed those impossible reunions in all the language of providence and restored purpose. Yet it is one thing for a failing empire to receive a lord of war who brings with him doctrine, command, and the brittle illusion of order. It is another thing entirely for it to feel the shadow of Fulgrim lengthen once more across the stars. That is not restoration. That is not salvation. That is not even conquest in its crude and recognizable form. It is corruption elevated into pageantry. It is refinement made rabid. It is the old sin of the heresy returning not as memory, but as appetite. And that is why the question now whispered in strategiums, in chapter keeps, in traitor covens, and in the cold machine sanctums of worlds that pretend they still possess the luxury of detachment, is not merely whether Fulgrim has returned to active war. That much, in the manner of such things, is already becoming impossible to deny. The darker question is what kind of war follows in the wake of such a being. Whether this can become the bloodiest conflict since the age when brother murdered brother beneath the Emperor's gaze. Not bloodiest by tally alone, though there will be no lack of corpses should the Phoenician truly cast his gaze across the firmament and deem it wanting. Bloodiest because wars of this nature do not merely burst bodies and drown worlds in the dead. They break meanings. They turn institutions inward against themselves. They corrode loyalties until every oath sounds hollow in the mouth and every creed begins to resemble the thing it was forged to oppose. That is the true danger of a Primarch, such as Fulgrim. Others bring ruin in ways the galaxy already understands. The butcher brings butchery. The warlord brings dominion. The plague king brings the slow obscenity of rot. Even the arch-deceiver, in all his sorcerous malice, remains comprehensible to those who have spent 10,000 years trying in vain to name the madness pressing at reality from beyond the veil. Fulgrim is worse. Fulgrim makes degradation beautiful. He makes surrender seem like transcendence. He dresses damnation in the robes of aspiration and bids the weak crawl toward it of their own accord. He does not simply destroy. He seduces, unmakes, remakes, and then laughs at the wreckage for imagining itself elevated. That corrosive power matters now more than it ever did in the old days of Chaos, or during the lunatic glory of the Great Crusade. The Imperium in this age is not merely embattled, it is hollowed. Its cathedrals still tower over hive chasms, its fleets still blacken the void, its saints are still nailed into history with enough incense and blood to stupefy whole sectors. But beneath all that monumental piety, there is fatigue. the kind of fatigue that reaches down into stone foundations and administrative habit alike. Whole subsectors endure not because they are governed well, but because the machinery of obedience has not yet quite failed. Whole crusades are declared not because victory is plausible, but because the confession of weakness is unthinkable. Every institution of the throne survives by ritual repetition and controlled amnesia. And into such a realm comes the possibility of Fulgrim, who is himself a blasphemy of memory. A son once made to embody perfection, now risen as the exquisite patron of excess, humiliation, and ecstatic ruin. It would be error enough to imagine that such a return threatens only the Imperium. The Imperium is the most obvious victim because it always is. It is the vast carcass upon which all predators feed. But Fulgrim's re-emergence cuts along 3 fronts at once, and each wound can be made to fester until the whole age begins to stink of it. The first front is the Imperium itself, whose defenders must reckon not only with a military threat, but with a symbolic one. The second lies among the traitor hosts, who are no harmonious empire of darkness, but a kennel of ancient grievances, God-sworn rivalries, and ambitions sharpened by 10 millennia of failure. A demon primarch of such appetite does not rise without disturbing the pecking order of the damned. The third and perhaps most poisonous front lies within the Emperor's children. For what are they now but fragments, splinters, shards of a broken mirror still trying to remember the face that once looked into it? This matters because the Emperor's children have not merely been absent, they have been unmade by their own devotions. They have spent centuries dissolving into war bands, coteries, cultic brotherhoods, and narcissistic little kingdoms of sensation. Their wars have often been petty by the standards of the great traitor hosts, yet no less vile for that pettiness. They have hunted not only for slaves, relics, chem stores, sonic armaments, and flesh to mutilate into some private revelation, but for proof that they still matter. Proof that their degradation was not simply decline, but apotheosis. Such beings do not unite easily. They compete, they posture, they betray, they turn blades upon one another for the sake of rank, memory, vanity, or the faint hope that somewhere, from the perfumed madness of the warp, their primarch may be watching. And now, perhaps, he is. That is what lends the present moment its chill. Not the certainty of a declared galactic war, for great wars do not always announce themselves at the threshold. Often the deadliest calamities begin in localized fire, in a disputed shrine world, in a frontier system whose tithes are already overdue, in a fortress monastery that sends one garbled astropathic plea before its choir goes blind and begins to claw its own faces away. They begin in rumor, in the seizure of a single moon, in the decapitation of one. Commander whose head becomes more valuable in death than 1,000 lives were in service. They begin with a symbol, a message, a world screaming in the dark while the wider galaxy, deafened by its own endless wars, takes too long to understand what it has heard. So it may be with Crucible. For now, that name hangs in the void, like the ember of a larger conflagration not yet fully seen. One world among uncounted worlds. One siege among 10,000 sieges. Yet the first flare is seldom important for its scale. It matters because of what it reveals in miniature. A pattern, a method, a desire. If Fulgrim's will is indeed moving through the Emperor's children once more, then Crucible is not merely a battlefield. It is a statement. It is the opening incision by which the surgeon reveals where he means to cut deeper. The war for one world may prove to be no more than the first chamber note in a symphony of mutilation, whose later movements will drag whole sectors into its rhythm. There must, however, be discipline even in dread. Some things are known, or as known as anything can be in a galaxy, where every truth is filtered through censorship, myth-making, madness, and the self-interest of those charged with recording it. Some things can be said with confidence. Fulgrim is no longer a distant shadow, suitable only for fearful recollection or indulgent speculation. The Emperor's children are no longer content to remain half-glimpsed raiders at the edge of grander wars. There is movement, there is intent, there is a convergence of sign and deed sufficient to force even the skeptical to admit that something has shifted. Beyond that, caution is warranted. The exact scope of the design remains obscured. The full measure of the Phoenicians' ambitions has not yet been laid bare before the galaxy like a flensed skin. Theory begins where certainty ends, and in times such as these, wise men learn to mark that border clearly, even when they know it will soon be trampled by events. Yet theory is not folly when it grows from pattern. Fulgrim has never represented simple conquest. Worlds taken by force are merely trophies. Cities burned are merely canvases reduced to ash. His real gift, if that word may be used for any power born of the great enemy, is transformation through desecration. To leave a world standing but spiritually gutted, to twist defenders into spectacles of their own failure, to force loyal men into choices so humiliating, so impossible, that survival itself becomes another form of contamination. Such a being does not need to slay the greatest number to birth the bloodiest age. He need only make every response to him more vicious, more panicked, more absolute. In that way alone he threatens the Imperium. In that way he threatens the traitor hosts who must decide whether to yield him room, oppose him, or be consumed in the turbulence of his ascent. In that way he threatens the Emperor's children themselves, for the return of a father can save broken sons only by first giving them a reason to slaughter one another for the right to stand nearest his radiance. This is how the old wound opens, not all at once, not with the clean brutality of a chain blade through the breastbone. It begins as pressure beneath scar tissue, a soreness in the memory of empire. The heresy was never buried properly. It was embalmed, enshrined, sermonized over and fed to generations who were ordered to hate it without ever being permitted to understand it. The result is an imperium that remembers disaster only in the forms least useful to surviving its repetition. It knows how to burn heretics. It knows how to canonize martyrs. It knows how to turn all failure into liturgy. It does not know how to face the return of an old horror without becoming more like that horror in the act of resisting it. And so the silence before the scream lengthens. Across fortress bridges and command cloisters, in shrine crypts where candles gutter in the recycled air, in traitor holds where legionaries painted in impossible hues listen for summons through the moan of tortured machinery. In the hidden chambers of those who study the movements of the damned not from courage, but because someone must. The sense grows that a threshold is near, not crossed yet perhaps, not fully, but near. The galaxy has heard such preludes before. It knows the pressure change before the storm front breaks. It knows the smell of burning oils before the reactor flame reaches the magazine. It knows that the most terrible wars begin not when the first city falls, but when enough hearts begin to understand that a single campaign may already be the herald of an age. If that is what Crucible proves to be, then posterity may one day look back upon this hour and name it for what it was. Not the outbreak, for that word is too clean. Not the commencement, for that suggests ceremony. It will be remembered, if memory itself survives the slaughter to come, as the moment the void first carried a note so pure in its malice, so lovely in its obscenity, that all who heard it mistook it for an echo. Only later will they understand. It was not an echo at all. It was the first beautiful, impossible note of a much larger massacre beginning to sing. The galaxy has known monsters before. It has known butchers whose coming could be measured in mountains of skulls and continents pounded into slurry beneath tread and shell. It has known tyrants who came clothed in doctrine, warlords whose every victory was another fortress world, folded into the mathematics of dominion. It has known plague kings, sorcerers, carrion prophets, and all the 1,000 other faces of ruin that rise again and again from the old wound of the Heresy. Yet Fulgrim was never merely another horror among horrors, and that is the truth now forcing itself upon the age like a jeweled dagger finding the seam in a gorget. He was the Phoenician. He was splendor given gene-wrought flesh. He was the promise that refinement, discipline, artistry, and martial perfection could coexist in one impossible being. In him, the Emperor's design seemed not only successful, but radiant. He was not fashioned to be loved as a brute is feared, nor obeyed as a bureaucrat is obeyed. He was fashioned to inspire awe, envy, and emulation. Even now, in this fouled millennium, that ancient shape still lingers in memory, and it is that memory which makes his return more poisonous than the reappearance of simpler beasts. Official, imperial, and traitor era material alike now place Fulgrim not as a distant relic of old damnation, but as an active force in the 41st millennium, with his scattered legion drawn once more beneath his attention, and his challenge set against the imperial world of Crucible. That is where lesser minds begin their error. They look upon his present form, upon the serpentine obscenity, the perfumed scales, the demonic wings, the shifting panoply of pride and appetite, and they imagine a fall into mere savagery. They comfort themselves with the notion that corruption always degrades, that it strips away complexity, that it reduces the once noble into something base and therefore easier to hate. But Fulgrim did not fall like a beast slipping into a sump trench. He refined himself into damnation. He pursued corruption as once he pursued excellence, with the same impossible standards and the same bright-eyed certainty that he alone understood what lay beyond the horizon of common striving. In another Primarch, treachery may present itself as bitterness, wrath, despair, or cold ambition. In Fulgrim, it became obsession. It became vanity sharpened into creed. It became the worship of sensation, the enthronement of the self, the belief that the universe existed to reflect his magnificence back at him in ever more exquisite forms. His was not the collapse of a fortress wall. It was the polishing of a blade until the hand that held it no longer remembered. There had ever been any purpose beyond the edge. That is why he is different from the returned sons, whose names have, in recent years, become rallying cries for the faithful and curses on the lips of the damned. When the Imperium beholds a Primarch such as Guilliman, it sees command, continuity, and the stern possibility that civilization may yet be bullied into coherence for a little longer. When it beholds the Lion, it sees the old knightly violence of resistance, a blade drawn from myth and set once more to the throats of traitors in the hour of utmost need. Their returns are received as hard miracles, warlike graces granted to a realm that has forgotten how to deserve grace at all. Fulgrim offers no such counterfeit comfort. His return is not a bastion. It is not a rallying standard. It is a contagion wrapped in majesty. It is the old nobility of the Imperium's lost golden sons, returned in a form so hideously transfigured that every witness is forced to confront the truth that perfection itself can rot and still retain the power to enthrall. Warhammer Community's own recent framing casts Guilliman's and the Lion's returns as seismic moments for the Loyalists, while Fulgrim's arrival is presented not as a stabilizing answer, but as the sixth Primarch to return to the 41st millennium in all his terrible glory and magnificence. Military danger alone would be catastrophe enough. A demon Primarch does not need embellishment to justify fear. Yet to speak of Fulgrim as if he were only another engine of annihilation is to miss the deepest nature of the threat. He is aesthetic corruption made sovereign. He wages war not only against flesh and fortification, but against judgment. He makes the foul alluring. He makes the profane ceremonially rich. He turns disgrace into theatre and mutilation into revelation. This is the poison that spreads wherever his shadow falls. Men do not merely see him and despair. Some see him and begin, against every oath, instinct, and prayer, to understand the appeal of surrender. Not because they mistake him for mercy, but because he manifests the oldest temptation in the human soul. The lie that one may be remade into something greater by yielding to appetite, by stepping beyond shame, by casting aside restraint and calling it freedom. He is not only a warlord, he is an argument against restraint made incarnate, and such arguments have slain more worlds than any fleet. The Emperor's children are his perfect instrument, because they have long since ceased to wage war in any manner a sane commander would recognize as sufficient unto itself. They do not merely kill, they perform killing, they ritualize it, they sculpt it into spectacle and memory. Their atrocities are not side effects of conquest, but statements of identity. A massacre is not complete until it has been made singular, until some new excess has been discovered within it, some fresh profanity of form or sensation torn from the shrieking. Dark and nailed into the record of the damned. This is why they are at once so dangerous and so unstable. A legionary of another traitor breed may slay for wrath, duty to the long war, devotion to a patron power, or the simple economics of terror. The sons of Fulgrim slay also to be seen, to be admired, to prove themselves superior not only to the dead at their feet, but to their own brothers, to the war bands beside them, and above all to the inconstant gaze of the Father they worship with equal measures of adoration and resentment. Recent official material makes that fractious nature plain, describing the Legion as scattered into disparate warbands driven by arrogance, internecine conflict, and divergent viewpoints, all while Fulgrim's challenge over Crucible turns their hunger for favor into a brutal test of worth. War, to Fulgrim, was never merely the settling of strategic necessities. Even in the bright lies of the Great Crusade, he sought more than victory. He sought flawless victory. Significant victory, beautiful victory. The battlefield was never only a place to break an enemy line. It was a proving chamber, a gallery, a mirror in which he might behold the splendor of his own mastery. Now, in his demonic ascension, that impulse has swollen into something infinitely more malign. A battlefield beneath Fulgrim's gaze becomes an audience chamber. Every shattered bastion is a stage. Every burning avenue is a processional way. Every duel is a recitation of his creed. Every corpse is a prop in an opera of humiliation. This is why his wars spread dread with such unusual speed. Survivors do not emerge from them speaking only of casualties and bombardment patterns. They speak of impossible colors in the smoke, of screams that became hymns, of transhuman killers who butchered men in set-piece rhythms as if obeying some hidden score, of commanders left alive solely so they could witness the arrangement of their own defeat. Such reports infect morale long before fleets arrive in orbit. They tell defenders not merely that they may die, but that death itself may be made ridiculous beneath the eye of the Phoenician. Pride also alters the shape of his ambition. A common conqueror wants worlds, because worlds yield ports, grain, labor, manufactoria, populations, and strategic position. A despoiler wants worlds because they can be desolated. A zealot wants worlds because they may be converted or purged. Fulgrim wants worlds, yes, but he wants something beneath and beyond possession. He wants acknowledgement. He wants theater on the scale of empires. He wants the galaxy to look upon his work and understand, in horror or in adoration, that no other hand could have wrought it. A nameless planetary sack would not satisfy him for long. Anonymous slaughter is for beasts and drudges. Fulgrim's appetite is aristocratic in the most obscene sense. He wants the prestigious, the symbolically loaded, the impossible, the worlds whose taking makes bystanders speak his name with bitterness and wonder. He wants his victories to humiliate rivals, seduce the weak, and force even those who despise him to grant that no lesser creature could have achieved such splendor in ruin. For that reason, Every campaign waged in his name is potentially contagious. Not because the Emperor's children possess some crude plague to spread from trench to trench, but because their victories poison what survives them. A regiment routed by iron discipline may break and reform elsewhere. A city blasted into rubble by ordinary siege may be rebuilt by zeal, labor, and time. But a world touched by Fulgrim often remains infected in less visible ways. Its defenders have been not only defeated, but shamed. Its symbols have been profaned with too much artistry ever to feel pure again. Its survivors carry memories that corrode certainty. Some become fanatics in reaction, embracing purges and doctrinal savagery that leave their own worlds bleeding long after the invader has gone. Others become secret worshippers of what they once resisted, not always in formal devotion, but in the private rot of the imagination. They begin to crave the transgression that horrified them. They begin to envy the freedom of the damned. They begin, in hidden rooms, to imitate what they ought only to fear. Thus a single campaign can continue conquering long after the fleets depart. Humiliation becomes imitation, terror becomes fascination, defeat becomes spiritual dismemberment. This is what makes Fulgrim the inverse of hope in the present age. The Imperium, poor diseased giant that it is, has learned to fashion fragile hopes around returned Primarchs. Hope of regained order, hope of avenging fire, hope that the old blood of the Emperor might still bear enough authority to arrest the slide into terminal decay. Guilliman represents the labor of holding together what should have collapsed already. The lion represents the sudden violence of resistance, the old blade, returning from legend to strike where all seemed lost. Fulgrim is their dark reflection. He is the proof that return is not in itself a blessing. He is the triumph of the wound that never healed. He is the heresy not as history, but as recurrence. He does not stride back into the age to mend the sundered inheritance of mankind. He comes to demonstrate that the inheritance was always vulnerable to corruption from within, that grandeur can be inverted without losing any of its power to command the eye or unman the heart. In him, the Imperium sees not merely an enemy, but the splendor of its own myths dragged through perfumed filth and raised again as mockery. Recent official descriptions emphasize exactly that inversion. Fulgrim as the grotesque manifestation of the great fall of the once noble Emperor's children, while his legion still worships and idolizes their cruel and capricious master. And if that is the nature of the being now moving once more at the edge of present events, then panic alone will not suffice. Hatred alone will not suffice. Even awe, that oldest poison in the blood of mankind, will not suffice. One must understand the shape of the threat before one can judge the scale of the war that may follow it. The Phoenician is different because he is not content to break worlds. He wishes to enchant their destruction, to make them complicit in the form of their own undoing, to turn every siege line into a stage and every atrocity into a signature. That is why the first question cannot simply be how strong he is, or how many warbands answer his summons, or how many systems may burn in the first rush of his ambition. The first question must be simpler and darker than that. What precisely has the latest law already confirmed of his return, his legion and the opening move now gathering around Crucible? For until that spine of certainty is laid bare, all later prophecies of blood and fire remain merely the shadows cast by a splendor too terrible to behold directly. Let there be no confusion now, no indulgence in the old habit of treating Fulgrim as a distant and ornamental terror, a name muttered over ancient betrayals and lacquered into the mythology of the Long War, while more immediate monsters did the killing in his stead. That indulgence no longer survives contact with the latest official material. Fulgrim is being framed not as a relic of past corruption, nor as some half-remembered demon prince lurking beyond relevance, but as an active force in the present age of the 41st millennium, one whose hand has once more closed around the fate of his shattered legion. The recent wave of official material does not whisper this. It declares it plainly through the new novel built around his renewed activity, through the launch of the Emperor's Children as a fully foregrounded force, and through the repeated insistence that his return is no abstraction, but an event with consequences for the age now burning beneath the throne's failing light. This matters because language matters in such times, and the language of the latest canon is not the language of background menace. It is the language of re-entry, of renewed primarchal presence, of activity brought violently into the current millennium. The official interview surrounding Fulgrim, the perfect son, frames the novel itself as an exploration of his return and of what that return does to the Emperor's children, while Jude Reed speaks of bringing Fulgrim back into the actual workings of the 41st millennium rather than leaving him as a spectral inheritance from older wars. The earlier preview material says the same thing in a more martial register, tying the novel directly to the announcement of his return and placing it beside his new miniature and the larger emergence of the Legion as a present force rather than a fading echo. That is the canon anchor, not possibility, not fan conjecture, not the fever of those who mistake every new release for apocalypse. Fulgrim is back within the active machinery of the setting, and the setting itself is being told to reckon with him. Nor has this been done in isolation, as though one novel were being asked to carry the weight of an old monster's resurrection on its own bent spine. The surrounding codex and range material make clear that the Emperor's children are no longer being handled as peripheral raiders who drift in from the edge of another villain's campaign merely to add perfume, noise, and mutilation before vanishing into the warp with holdfuls of screaming trophies. They are being staged as a major force, now making a decisive move. One official preview declares outright that after their initial incursion into real space, the Sons of Fulgrim are now making their great play, while the Codex presentation expands them into a full army treatment with their own detachments, units, internal themes, and battlefield identity. Another preview underscores the same shift by describing a brand new army range unveiled in concert with Fulgrim himself. This is not the narrative posture reserved for scavengers haunting the margins. It is the posture of a legion being pushed toward the center of the board, not as seasoning for someone else's war, but as the authors of a fresh atrocity in their own right. At the heart of that fresh atrocity stands Crucible. It is here that the latest law plants its standard, and it does so with admirable cruelty. Fulgrim has issued a challenge to his scattered warriors. They are to vanquish the imperial world of Crucible and bring him the head of the Black Templar, charged with its defense. This is the first hard narrative seed, the one that can be held up against all later speculation to see what grows faithfully from canon and what sprawls beyond it into inference. One world, one command, one chosen head demanded as token and proof. Yet even in that simple command, the nature of Fulgrim's return is already visible. He does not call merely for conquest. He calls for a demonstration. A world must fall, yes, but it must fall in a way that advertises worth to the father who has once again taken interest in his sons. The target is imperial. The defender is a Black Templar, which means faith, obstinacy, and righteous violence are built into the structure of the conflict from the beginning. The challenge itself is personal, ceremonial, and humiliating. This is not a harvest raid. This is a trial staged by a Primarch. Just as important is the fact that the official synopsis refuses to describe Crucible as some swift atrocity concluded in a blur of screaming color and perfect blades. On the contrary, the repeated formulation is that what ought to have been a swift and bloody offensive becomes a grueling siege. That distinction is everything. A raid is an act of predation. A siege is a condition. It has duration, consequence, and room enough for every form of rot to mature. A raid leaves ruins. A siege leaves histories. It forces both attacker and defender to reveal what they become when slaughter is stretched into routine and expectation curdles into obsession. The official materials do not present the Emperor's children as descending, despoiling, and departing. They present them as being caught, tested, and transformed within the drawn-out furnace of a war that should have been easy. In other words, the first great act of Fulgrim's active return to the present millennium is already linked, not to a passing outrage, but to prolonged conflict. The significance of that cannot be overstated. Then comes the line that matters most for any larger thesis about what this may herald. The official Black Library synopsis states that Fulgrim's designs reach beyond the conquest of a single planet. That is the fulcrum upon which all further dread now turns. The canon does not yet map the entire design. It does not enumerate target sectors, announce a new galactic civil war, or stamp a neat title upon the scale of blood yet to be spilled. But it does something perhaps more dangerous. It opens the horizon. It tells us plainly that Crucible is not an end state. It is not even necessarily the true objective in itself. It is part of a wider intention held in the mind of a demon primarch, whose sons barely understand him, and whose enemies have scarcely begun to grasp that he is once more playing for present stakes. This is why one world matters so much. In the old logic of imperial survival, one world is always one among millions. In the logic of primarchal war, one world can be a thesis statement. The other detail the official synopsis insists upon is, if anything, even more poisonous. The Legion turns its weapons inward as well as outward. That one truth drags the whole matter out of the realm of straightforward invasion and into the deeper, more fertile darkness of fraternal fracture. The Emperor's children do not simply descend upon Crucible as a unified instrument of their gene sire's will. They arrive as scattered, arrogant, competing claimants to his approval, and the war around them becomes as much a test of internal worth as an act of external destruction. The author interview reinforces this by describing the Legion at the opening of the tale as disparate, splintered into rival warbands and cults of personality, all of which begin to change when Fulgrim takes an active interest in them again and demands that they prove themselves. This matters because it gives the conflict multiple fronts without ever leaving the same theater. Crucible burns. The Black Templars resist. Imperial lives are ground into ash. Yet at the same time, the Emperor's children are also measuring one another, hating one another, betraying one another, and asking how much of themselves may be carved away in the attempt to deserve their Primarch's gaze. That is why this single setup is so rich with implication. One world, one command, one siege, and yet within that frame lie nearly all the larger questions that could define the next stage of the setting. What becomes of a broken legion when its father demands cohesion but feeds on rivalry? What becomes of an imperial defense when the foe is not content merely to breach walls, but to make the war itself into a test of corruption and significance? What becomes of the wider galaxy when the first major act of Fulgrim's current relevance is not a passing cameo, but a crucible in the truest sense? A furnace in which Legiones Astartes' pride, imperial martyrdom, and demonic ambition are all thrust together until each begins to melt into the others. Official material already presents Fulgrim's renewed role as something seismic for his sons, and the Codex and range rollout present the Legion as stepping fully into the spotlight, as a force built for world conquest rather than decorative malice. When a setting makes those choices in concert, wise readers do not dismiss them as isolated embellishments. They read them as signs of an advancing storm front. Still, discipline must rule where excitement would prefer to feast. It is essential to say this plainly. The claim that Fulgrim's return could ignite the bloodiest war since the Heresy remains theory. It is a strong theory, perhaps even a grimly persuasive one, but it is not an official label placed upon present events by the canon itself. No source yet declares that such a war has begun. No official preview has proclaimed a second heresy in all but name. What the canon does confirm is narrower, and for that reason, more dangerous. Fulgrim has been brought back into active relevance in the 41st millennium. His return is being explicitly explored in current fiction. The Emperor's children are being positioned as a major force with a full codex, range, and present-day narrative identity. Crucible is the opening battlefield attached to that return. The campaign there is a grueling siege rather than a passing atrocity. Fulgrim's ambitions extend beyond a single world. His legion is at war with itself as well as the enemy. Those are not speculations. Those are the stones already laid. Everything beyond them must be built carefully, or not at all. But once those stones are acknowledged, the old question changes shape. It is no longer whether Fulgrim matters. That question is dead. The latest canon has already nailed it to the gate. He matters. He is active. His legion is moving under his shadow. Crucible burns beneath the burden of his will. The true question now is broader, colder, and far less comfortable. How far will the ripples travel? How many warbands will be drawn into alignment or annihilation by his renewed attention? How many imperial institutions will convulse in answer to the obscenity of his return? How many sectors will feel the pressure change before they understand what is coming for them? The first flare has already been seen. The only uncertainty left is how much of the night it will set alight. There are legions that were broken and knew themselves broken. There are traitor hosts that fell into the eye as armies and emerged as packs of beasts, their old heraldry eaten by warp fire, their structures reduced to hunger, fear, and the authority of whichever murderer stood tallest atop the heap of the dead. The Emperor's children were never quite so honest in their ruin. In memory, in vanity, in all the perfumed tomb chambers of their recollection, they never ceased to think of themselves as a legion. The old grandeur still clings to them like scent to funeral silk. They remember parades beneath perfect standards. They remember the measured harmonies of compliance. They remember themselves as exemplars, as artists of war, as the most refined edge in the Emperor's hand. Yet in practice, that legion has long since ceased to exist in any clean or disciplined sense. Official material now presents them as scattered suns, competing warbands and self-centered champions pulled apart by appetite, ego, and the desperate need to matter beneath Fulgrim's gaze. That contradiction is at the heart of what makes them so pitiful and so dangerous. They still speak the language of inheritance. They still drape themselves in the remnants of old honors, in the names of companies and brotherhoods that have not existed as coherent military entities for ages beyond counting. They still imagine themselves the rightful heirs to greatness, the chosen sons of the Phoenician, the warriors who once stood nearest to perfection before the galaxy's lesser souls, recoiled from truths too elevated for common flesh to bear. Yet when one looks beyond the lacquered plate, the gilded filigree, and the elegance of their chosen instruments, what remains is carrion splendor, exquisitely armed scavengers, narcissists with bolt guns and sonic shriekers, predators so consumed by their own image that they mistake self-display for destiny. The official faction material leans into exactly that split, describing them as once noble, but now wholly consumed by excess, pride and the pursuit of sensation beyond all reason or restraint. So they fragment, as all creatures of such appetite must. One warband pursues perfection through the mathematics of the duel, stripping battle down to ritual challenges and the choreography of elite murder. Another exalts the scream, the pulse, the ecstatic violence of sonic devastation, reducing war to crescendos of ruptured organs and liquefied bone. Another buries itself in narcotic visions, convinced that new strata of truth lie buried somewhere beneath enough suffering, enough stimulation, enough blasphemous revision of the flesh. Others still become little courts of mutual adoration and betrayal, each champion enthroned among flatterers, chem savants, body slaves, chirurgeons and parasites, while proclaiming himself the purest vessel of the Legion's old ideal. Such splintering is not incidental. It is the natural state of warriors who have replaced obedience with appetite and discipline with preference. Official commentary around Fulgrim. The Perfect Son makes this plain by calling them scattered sons and competing warbands, while the newer faction material repeatedly stresses the Emperor's children as seekers of transcendent sensations, decadent slaughter, and their own chosen modes of excess. And yet even in this degradation, they are still orbiting something greater than themselves. That is the tragedy, and the hook sunk deepest into their transhuman hearts. They have not ceased yearning for a center of gravity. They have only lost the capacity to build one among themselves. No Lord Exultant, no Bladesman, no shrieking Maestro of Massacre can truly replace the absent splendor of Fulgrim. He is the old axis around which their self-understanding still turns, even when they pretend otherwise. That is why his renewed activity in the present age is so consequential. It does not merely give them a commander. It gives them orientation. It gives them the possibility, however warped, of coherence. Not the austere coherence of the Ultramarines with their doctrine and civic machinery, nor the bitter practical cohesion of siege masters or plague hosts, but something more poisonous, a shared object of longing. The latest official material frames precisely this dynamic, with Fulgrim laying down a challenge to his sons and their scattered elements lurching toward one another under the pressure of his attention. Approbation is the true fuel in their veins. They do not merely desire victory, because victory alone is too impersonal. It can be claimed by anyone. It can be tallied by quartermasters and remembered by dull administrators of empire. What they want is to be seen, to be noticed by the Father whose beauty was once their law and whose corruption is now their scripture. They want his gaze upon them, whether approving, amused, or cruelly curious. They want to be singular in his sight. This is why the challenge of Crucible is so much more potent than a simple order to conquer. It converts war into audition. It turns every assault, every duel, every atrocity, and every sacrifice into an offering laid before an audience of one. Official previews say this openly enough, describing champions desperate for their father's favor and asking whether his illustrious gaze is worth the ultimate sacrifice. That is not mere flavor text. It is the key to how the Legion now behaves when roused by Fulgrim's direct interest. Once battle becomes a plea for notice, tactical efficiency begins to rot. Not everywhere, not all at once, and not to the point of uselessness, for the Emperor's children remain terrifyingly skilled, but the hierarchy of value changes. A swift kill may be less prized than a memorable one. A strategically sound breakthrough may be abandoned in favor of a duel too exquisite to ignore. A city may be taken more slowly because speed offers too little. Opportunity for theater. A commander may spare a worthy foe only so the second meeting can be staged before a wider audience of allies and rivals. Excess demands witnesses. Perfection, in their corrupted understanding, demands distinction. Thus, battlefield conduct bends toward display, transgression, and singular acts of slaughter that cannot be mistaken for anyone else's work. The official faction language surrounding them emphasizes just this blend of arrogance, duelist pride, decadent slaughter, and the need to seek transcendent sensation through war itself. This is what makes them unstable allies and even more dangerous enemies. In the normal military sense, they are not predictable. One can predict that they will seek sensation, dominance, and self-expression, but not always how those desires will overrule prudence in a given moment. They may cooperate brilliantly for an hour, and then open fire on supposed comrades, because an insult was too slighting, a prize too alluring, or a rival too successful to endure. They may hurl themselves at impossible fortifications, not from desperation, but because the challenge flatters them. They may prolong a campaign precisely because the slow grind affords more opportunities for excess, more bodies to break, more chances to imprint themselves upon the memory of the foe. Even among traitors, this is hazardous. A commander can negotiate with greed, with vengeance, even with madness if madness obeys some recurrent law. Narcissism, elevated into religion, is far more volatile. The newest material around the Legion repeatedly underscores this, presenting them as proud, self-centered, and prone to internal violence, even while facing the enemy beyond their lines. War, for such beings, is inseparable from performance. That truth is visible in every line of their current flavor. They arrive with dramatic flourishes. They seek not merely victory, but ambivalent battle, transcendent sensation, and the perfect arrangement of terror. To face them is to be cast in a role whether one wishes it or not. The defender becomes the foil, the audience, the raw material from which the scene is made complete. Cities become stagecraft, vox nets become amplifiers, mass graves become installations. A bastion breached is not merely a tactical achievement, but the lifting of a curtain. The enemy is not only to be beaten, but directed, humiliated, and made to participate in the pageant of his own undoing. This is why survivors of the Emperor's children so often sound deranged, even when they speak true. They have not merely witnessed slaughter, they have been drafted into someone else's grotesque performance. The official previews of the new range and codex almost revel in this theatrical identity, presenting the Legion's arrival as dramatic, ecstatic, excessive, and wholly committed to spectacle. No single figure better captures the curse of this Legion than Lucius. He is vanity honed to a killing edge, and then condemned never to dull. Official material still presents him as seemingly unkillable, a duelist of immense skill whose boundless ego is as feared as his cursed blade. He endures as emblem and warning alike. In him the Emperor's children behold what it means to make self-regard into immortality. Not noble immortality, not the endurance of memory or duty, a humiliating, parasitic survival in which pride itself becomes the mechanism by which damnation perpetuates itself. Lucius is not an aberration from the Legion's soul. He is one of its purest revelations. Every duel is about himself. Every victory is theater. Every death is merely another obscene proof that the self, once enthroned above all else, can become both prison and sacrament. That the Legion still exalts him tells us everything about what it admires in its own reflection. And so the shattered sons of the Phoenician do not require healing in any loyalist sense. They do not require repentance nor restored doctrine nor the rebuilding of the old Legion as it once was beneath the Aquila and the Emperor's stern light. Fulgrim does not need to make them disciplined in the manner of Macraga, where order exists to preserve strength and distribute force with rational purpose. He needs far less, and therefore far more. He needs only enough shared narcissism pointed in one direction, enough pride aligned with enough hunger, enough rival champions convinced that the road to singular glory lies through the same burning gate. Give the Emperor's children that much, and they will supply the rest themselves. The shrieking advance, the ritualized betrayal, the exquisite massacres, the desperate race to become unforgettable in their father's sight. A legion in memory, a pack of peacocks and cannibals in practice. Yet under the gaze of Fulgrim, even that may prove sufficient to shake worlds. Crucible burns already, and that is the first lesson. It does not burn because it is the most sacred world in the Imperium, nor because its manufactoria alone sustain a dozen crusades, nor because its shrine vaults contain some singular relic without which the corpse empire must surely collapse. Worlds far richer, holier, and more strategically prized have been left to fester or die in this age. Crucible burns because Fulgrim has chosen it, and the choice itself is the message. That is how beings such as he declare intention. They do not begin with the objective valuation of the administratum, nor with the neat geometry of a cartographer's star charts. They begin where symbolism, cruelty, and opportunity may be made to overlap. A world is selected not merely to be taken, but to be made meaningful through its torment. In the official account now set before the setting, Crucible is the opening theatre in which Fulgrim sets his scattered sons a challenge and, in so doing, turns one imperial world into the first spoken phrase of a wider design. The target matters because of who stands upon its walls and in its killing grounds. An imperial world defended by a Black Templar is never merely another fortified holding. It becomes, by its very nature, an altar of absolutism. The Sons of Dawn in black plate do not yield in moderation. They do not contextualize. They do not negotiate with filth and call it prudence. They answer blasphemy with the sword, corruption with the pyre, and ambiguity with vows spoken over revving chainswords. To set the Emperor's children against such defenders is to engineer more than a military collision. It is to place decadent blasphemy in direct contest with weaponized zeal. On one side stands a legion that has transformed war into appetite, theatre, and self-adoration. On the other stands a chapter that makes renunciation, hatred, and martyrdom into sacrament. Even before the first bastion falls, the campaign is already charged with more than tactical significance. It becomes a contest over whose vision of transcendence may stain the stones last. The official synopsis makes that antagonism explicit by centering the defense around a Black Templar whose death is demanded as prize and offering alike. That demand for a specific head is no small embellishment. It is the hinge on which the whole character of the war swings. Conquest alone is impersonal. Worlds are consumed every day in this age by enemies too numerous for memory to number, and too banal in their savagery to be remembered as anything but statistical ruin. But a head demanded by a Primarch changes the register of the conflict. It makes the campaign ceremonial. It turns battlefield success into public humiliation. The defenders are no longer merely obstacles to be crushed. They are cast in a drama whose central act is decapitation, proof, and presentation. The Black Templar commander ceases to be only a military leader and becomes a trophy, a living emblem of imperial defiance marked out for ritual degradation. For the Emperor's children, that matters far more than an abstract victory. It means that every breach, every duel, every atrocity committed around Crucible may be interpreted as part of a competition to decide who will be remembered by Fulgrim as the hand that delivered the desired relic. The official wording does not present this as incidental garnish. It presents the demand for the commander's head as the defining object set before the legions would be champions. That, in turn, is why Crucible should be read as more than a battlefield. It is a prototype. It is the first clear sample of what a Primarch-led Emperor's Children war may look like in this era. Not swift, not clean, not reducible to raid doctrine or pirate predation, but prolonged, spiteful, performative, and loaded with opportunities for betrayal. The official sources insist on this point in language too deliberate to ignore. What should have been swift becomes grueling. What should have been a bloody offensive becomes siege. Those words matter because a siege is fertile ground for all the worst. Habits of the Third Legion. It gives time for rivalries to mature, for oaths to curdle, for the search for favor to become more consuming than the reduction of the enemy. It gives room for warbands to measure one another while they measure the walls. It gives every champion enough delay to begin asking not merely how to win, but how to win memorably. The canon setup therefore already implies something larger than one hard campaign. It suggests a method. The drawn-out nature of the conflict may itself be a clue to Fulgrim's values. This is interpretation, not explicit proclamation, but it rests on the shape of the official premise. A swift victory would have delivered the world. A grueling siege does something else. It transforms, it strips masks away. It reveals what a legion has become when denied immediate gratification and forced to steep in its own appetites. Fulgrim's plans, we are told, go far beyond a single planet. If that is so, then the duration of Crucible may not be a mere complication. It may be useful. A long war exposes weakness and breeds invention. It drives warbands into excesses they might not otherwise dare. It compels the worthy, the vain, and the desperate alike to show what they will sacrifice for approbation. For a Primarch whose whole corrupted nature is bound to revelation through excess, there is an ugly logic in letting the furnace burn longer, so the ore within may be tested to destruction. A siege also gives the Emperor's children room enough to indulge every appetite that defines them. There is time for terror raids in the sleepless dark beyond the trench lines, for dual circles lit by burning habstacks, for sonic atrocities that turn cathedral districts into chambers of liquefied marrow and ruptured lungs. There is time for narcotic warfare, for chem clouds and tainted ecstasies loosed upon defenders already half-starved, for corrupted stimuli to be broadcast through captured vox arrays until discipline frays into hallucination. There is time for internecine competition, which may be the deadliest luxury of all. The current faction framing leans heavily into these themes, presenting the Emperor's children as seekers of transcendent sensation, decadent slaughter, arrogant dueling and war waged in a fever of performance rather than sober necessity. A siege is the ideal theatre for such beings, because it does not simply ask them to kill. It gives them space to elaborate on killing until slaughter itself becomes their language. Thus, Crucible becomes a proving ground in the fullest and ugliest sense. Every warband can approach the same command and reach a different answer about what it means to deserve the Primarch's favor. One may seek it through sheer butcher's accounting, by drowning districts in the dead. Another may pursue perfection of blade work, hunting the enemy elite in ordered chains of duels. Another may seek to orchestrate the grandest spectacle, the most unforgettable, profanation, the atrocity whose elegance or obscenity will make it impossible for Fulgrim to ignore. This is what makes the campaign more than a simple theatre of conquest. It is also a tribunal, though no law governs it, save vanity. The official material around Fulgrim, the perfect son, stresses exactly this fractious condition, describing the Legion as disparate, arrogance-ridden, and internally violent, even as the war for Crucible consumes them from without. That is fertile narrative ground, because each assault upon the world is also an argument between brothers over the proper form of excess. The defenders, for their part, are unlikely to realize the full obscenity of their predicament at once. At first they fight as defenders always fight in the Imperium, for walls, for relics, for civilians, for oath and chapter honor, and the bitter arithmetic of delay. They count shells, ration promethium, hold breach lines, and wait for relief that may never cross the void in time. But gradually the shape of the war must become impossible to ignore. This is not merely an invasion. It is a spectacle built for someone else's pleasure. The raids are too ornate, the desecrations too deliberate, the choices of target and timing too loaded with insult to be explained by utility alone. The enemy behaves not like a force trying only to conquer, but like actors straining to outshine one another before an absent audience. That realization is spiritually corrosive. To discover one's world is not even the true object, but the stage upon which another being seeks affirmation, is to understand humiliation on a planetary scale. The official synopsis does not spell out the defender's perspective, but its emphasis on Fulgrim's wider design and the Legion's internal competition strongly supports this reading as an inference from canon, and that is why Crucible matters beyond itself. If this form of war works once, it can be repeated, not in every detail, for no two worlds are humiliated by exactly the same hand, but in structure. Choose a target rich in symbolic tension, set a personal prize within it, gather fractured warbands beneath one command without truly reconciling them. Let the siege stretch until both attacker and defender are transformed by its duration. Turn every bastion into a stage, every atrocity into a signature, every loyalist act of resistance into material for a more exquisite desecration. If such a method yields not merely conquest, but recruitment, revelation, and a renewed center of gravity for the Emperor's children, then it ceases to be a single campaign and becomes a template for sector-wide contagion. This remains an inference, but it is one drawn directly from the official combination of facts: Fulgrim's active return, the Legion's scattered state, Crucible as challenge, the grueling nature of the siege, and plans declared to reach beyond one planet. That is the warning hidden inside the first flare. Men fear declared crusades because crusades are loud. They come with proclamations, banners, fleet movements, astropathic panic, and all the ceremonial thunder by which empires announce their intent to bleed. Prototype wars are more dangerous. They arrive disguised as local catastrophe. They seem containable until their logic is understood, and by then the logic has often already escaped the original battlefield. Crucible may prove to be only one world amid the ash of 1,000 others, but if it is the first perfected demonstration of how Fulgrim means his sons to wage war in this era, then its importance cannot be measured in tonnage destroyed or hive districts lost. It will have shown a method for making conquest into corruption, siege into audition, and one planet's agony into the opening model for a much wider age of elegant slaughter. Prototype wars, for that very reason, are often more dangerous than openly declared crusades. If Fulgrim's plans reach beyond the conquest of a single world, then what is it that he truly wants? That is the question hanging now above Crucible, like a blade on a chain, gleaming, motionless for the instant, before it begins its descent. It is not enough to answer that he wants victory. Victory is the least of what such a being desires. It is not enough to say that he wants blood, for blood has flowed in his name across 10,000 years, and never once did the shedding of it sate him. One must look at the shape of the latest cannon, at the condition of his legion, at the nature of the challenge he has set, and ask what kind of design would require all these elements at once. The official line tells us only that his scattered sons have been denied their birthright, that he has set them upon Crucible, and that his plans go far beyond the conquest of a single planet. The rest must be reasoned from pattern, but the pattern is already ugly enough to justify dread. The first and simplest theory is that Fulgrim means to turn the Emperor's children from a broken inheritance into a visible, undeniable power block once more. For too long they have existed as a contradiction, famous in terror, insignificant in structure. Their reputation has remained immense, while their practical unity has rotted into rival warbands, narcissistic little courts, and self-consuming bands of sybaritic killers. Official material says as much, describing the Legion as fractured into disparate warbands and scattered sons competing for favor beneath their father's renewed attention. That is not the profile of a power that can reshape an age. It is the profile of a legacy trapped in its own debris. If Fulgrim means to matter on the scale a Primarch believes he deserves, then mere isolated predation cannot suffice. He requires visibility, density, mass. He requires his legion not simply to exist in memory, but to stand in the void once more as something that cannot be dismissed as decorative corruption on the margins of grander wars. That ambition would explain much. It would explain why the Emperor's children are being presented in current official material not as fleeting raiders, but as a fully foregrounded force, supported by a new codex, a substantial range, and a story expressly built around their Primarch's return to present relevance. That kind of framing suggests more than a brief resurgence. It suggests consolidation of identity. In narrative terms, it means the Legion is being moved from the periphery toward the center. In strategic terms within the fiction, it implies something still darker, that Fulgrim may wish his sons to become recognizable again as a bloc, a banner, a threat with enough coherence to alter sector-level decision-making. The Imperium can endure scattered butchers for a while. It struggles far more when old names recover enough shape to become campaign-defining realities. But if that were all, it would still be too simple for Fulgrim. He was never merely a collector of territory, never merely a bureaucrat of conquest in the old style of the Great Crusade. That leads to the second theory, and perhaps the more poisonous one. He may seek not only conquest, but re-legionization through competition. Not the rebuilding of the Third Legion, as it once marched beneath the Emperor's Aquila, but the forging of a new and utterly corrupted equivalent, one in which only the most excessive, ruthless, memorable, and spiritually ruined survive close enough to matter. The official synopsis of Fulgrim, the perfect son, already gestures toward this savage filtration, with Crucible becoming a grueling siege in which the Legion turns its weapons inward as well as outward, and the would-be champions are forced to ask what they will sacrifice for victory and their Primarch's favor. That is more than a battlefield complication. It is a mechanism of selection. In that light, Fulgrim's challenge begins to resemble less a simple order and more a furnace. He gathers the fragments of his inheritance and thrusts them into a war sufficiently prolonged, humiliating and unstable that only certain kinds of sons can emerge intact from it, assuming any integrity remains possible for such creatures at all. The old Legion dies a little more with every betrayal, every duel, every act of flamboyant excess that places individual distinction above common purpose. Yet from that very death, a new form of cohesion may arise. Not brotherhood in any noble sense, not discipline as Gilliman would understand it, nor chain-bound obedience as Perturabo would demand. Something more Slaneshi, more malignant, and therefore in its own way more resilient. A re-legionization through appetite. A hierarchy built not on trust, but on demonstrated splendor in violence and the willingness to become unforgettable in the pursuit of approbation. Then there is the third theory, and this one reaches closest to the Primarch himself. Fulgrim may want a war worthy of his self-image, something so vast, so ornate, so exquisitely appalling that the whole galaxy is forced to look at him again. Not glance, not remember, not include his name in the muttered inventories of traitor divinities and old sins. But look, to be truly seen is one of the oldest obsessions of his line. He was made for splendor, for impossible standards, for the admiration and envy of those around him. His corruption did not destroy that need, it enthroned it. A single world, no matter how bitterly contested, is only the opening gesture if what he craves is recognition on a scale befitting the Phoenician's own understanding of himself. The official preview materials place him squarely back in the spotlight, with his return to the 41st millennium treated as an event, and his legion's movements tied directly to that renewed prominence. From within the fiction, it would be entirely fitting for Fulgrim to desire not just conquest, but a spectacle grand enough that every throne room, war council, and shrine crypt in the galaxy is forced to acknowledge that one of the Emperor's most beautiful sons has returned as magnificent blasphemy. These theories are not mutually exclusive. In the logic of Slanesh, they may well be the same project seen from different angles. Vanity, empire, sensation, and apocalypse need not compete with one another when the architect of the scheme believes all things exist to be arranged into expressions of his magnificence. To build the Emperor's children into a visible power block is to win acknowledgement. To force them through internecine competition into a sharper, more terrible form is to refine sensation through suffering. To ignite a war so immense that sectors shudder beneath it is to craft an artwork in blood large enough to match the scale of his delusion. For Fulgrim, Practical gain and aesthetic gratification are never cleanly separable. Every empire is also a mirror. Every war is also a performance. Every scream is both casualty and chorus. The current official positioning of the Emperor's children leans heavily into this same fusion of martial purpose and ecstatic identity, describing them as seekers of excess, of transcendent sensation, of battle conducted as a kind of heightened self-expression rather than mere strategic necessity. That is why Fulgrim should not be mistaken for a simple empire builder in the mold of the old Crusade Primarchs. He is not trying to recreate Chemos on a galactic scale, nor to govern an ordered dominion in any conventional sense. He is trying to impose a corrupted aesthetic order on chaos itself. The traitor realms are notoriously unstable, their alliances fleeting, their wars cannibalistic, their gods jealous, and their champions swollen with ego. Fulgrim's genius for corruption has always lain in making the unstable seem elevated, the profane seem refined. If he can gather enough of the Third Legion's descendants, point their rival hungers in one direction, and turn each conquest into both victory and performance, then he has not simply taken territory, he has imposed style on anarchy. He has made chaos cohere, however briefly, around the principle of his own taste. That may be closer to his true ambition than any mundane count of worlds seized. Every victory under such a design would also function as recruitment. Not formal recruitment alone, though the swollen ranks of renegades, slaves, cultists, noise marines and damned aspirants would surely gather wherever the scent of success thickened. More importantly, each victory would act as a summons to the scattered war bands of the Emperor's children themselves. Those currently lurking at the edges of relevance, pursuing petty glories and private ecstasies, would feel the pull of a center reasserting itself. A fortress world falls after a grueling contest. A Black Templar's head is taken. Fulgrim's greater plan advances by one blood-soaked measure. What self-adoring champion of the Third could fail to wonder whether there is now a place near that radiance for him? What decadent pirate prince? What duelist lord? What shrieking artisan of sonic murder would not feel the old craving to bring his blades, his fleet, and his followers back into orbit around the legend of the Phoenician? The Black Library synopsis itself frames the Emperor's children as having long been condemned to ravage world after futile world in pursuit of ambition and excess, followed by the ominous declaration that this is so no longer. That is the language not of drift, but of recall. If that reading is right, then Fulgrim's return could transform the Emperor's children from parasitic raiders into something far worse, an event-generating engine of sector-wide collapse. Raiders despoil and move on. Even when they leave devastation behind, the devastation is localized and often intelligible. A Primarch-centered Emperor's children resurgence would behave differently. Each campaign would generate secondary crises, imperial overreaction, sectarian panic, rival traitor resentment, cultic bloom, theological convulsions wherever news of Fulgrim's return spread among the faithful. Worlds would not merely be attacked, they would become examples, warnings, invitations, tests. The Legion would cease to be a set of disconnected predators and become instead a machine for producing crises large enough to reshape neighboring theaters simply by existing. Current official material already shows the ingredients for this: a major force foregrounded in the setting, a Primarch actively returned to relevance, a target world under prolonged siege, internal Legion conflict and ambitions explicitly stretching beyond a single planet. Taken together, those are not the bones of a raid. They are the bones of an era. Such a transformation would also intensify the very rivalries that threaten to destroy the Legion, making it bloodier and more effective at the same time. That is the exquisite cruelty of Fulgrim's position. He need not abolish competition. He can weaponize it. He need not choose between coherence and narcissism if he can convince his sons that the road to personal exaltation runs through the same chain of worlds. Let them race one another to greater acts of excess. Let them betray, duel, sabotage and outshine each other beneath the pressure of his regard. So long as the whole fever points outward often enough, the aggregate result may still be expansion. In a sane military culture, this would be intolerable inefficiency. In the diseased aristocracy of the Emperor's children, it may prove to be the exact balance of instability and common purpose required to make them terrifying again. The official synopsis of Crucible as a siege in which the Legion fights both enemy and itself is what makes this interpretation so plausible. Their internal fracture is not a flaw external to the campaign, it is one of the campaign's engines, and that leads at last to the bleakest possibility of all. Fulgrim may not need to win cleanly. He may not need neat borders, durable administrations, or even universally loyal sons. He may need only to become impossible to ignore. If enough worlds burn in sufficiently memorable ways, if enough warbands rally or perish trying to earn his favor, if enough defenders are humiliated, seduced, or spiritually broken by the form his wars take, then he has already succeeded in the deepest sense available to a creature like him. He will have forced the galaxy to look. He will have turned his legion from a decadent afterthought into a crisis of meaning. He will have made every institution that opposes him define itself in relation to his obscenity. Clean victory is for rulers. Fulgrim's ambition may be grander and fouler than rule. It may be to make the age itself bear the mark of his return, until even those who resist him most fervently cannot speak of the future without first speaking his name. The Imperium does not stand because it is healthy. It stands because it has forgotten how to fall. That is the first truth that must be remembered when considering what a Fulgrim-led campaign would actually do to the corpse realm of mankind. This empire of cathedrals, ash worlds, shrine routes and endless ledgers is not held together by confidence, nor by abundance, nor by the old clean certainties that once lit the banners of the Great Crusade. It is held together by exhaustion made habitual, by faith made compulsory, and by a bureaucratic violence so vast that whole populations disappear into its workings without any individual hand ever seeming to have killed them. Orders move, tithes are collected, crusades are named, ships are redirected, regiments are spent, records are corrected, heresies are burned out with promethium and prayer. That is how the Imperium survives, not by peace, but by the management of permanent emergency. Into such a civilization, already stretched taut across too many wounds, the return of Fulgrim would not fall as a single spear thrust. It would strike like acid poured into cracks, long papered over with incense and lore. The official material around Fulgrim, the perfect sun, already establishes the outward shape of the threat. Fulgrim has returned to active relevance. The Emperor's children are set upon Crucible, and his designs run beyond the conquest of a single world. News of such a thing would never spread cleanly. The Imperium is too large for clarity, and too frightened of truth to permit it for long. The first reports would come broken. Survivor testimony from troop carriers limping clear of the war zone, with their machine spirits shrieking through burnt-out vox banks. Corrupted battlefield recordings, full of harmonics, no sane lex mechanic could classify without crossing himself afterward. Astropathic fragments, contradictory and half-flensed by the warp, carrying images of a radiant monstrosity, of shrines profaned with impossible elegance, of black Templars roaring, defiance into a storm of noise and silk and blood. By the time such reports reach sector capitals, they would already be competing with denials, with suppressions, with the quiet work of scribes and interrogators whose first instinct in the face of doctrinally dangerous truth is to file it beneath seals and warnings. That is not failure in the imperial sense. That is standard function. The regime has survived for 10,000 years by censoring panic until panic becomes unavoidable. A Primarch like Fulgrim weaponizes precisely that delay, because the gap between first witness and sanctioned acknowledgement is where rumor grows teeth.
Be sure to subscribe. You know you want to. If you don't, you'll be sent into the void and nobody will find you for the rest of your life. So go, be sure to subscribe. Remember, subscribe.
The Black Templars are, in this respect, almost the ideal first witnesses. No chapter in the Imperium is better suited to receiving obscenity with absolute refusal. Official Black Templars material describes them as the most zealous of all the Space Marine chapters. Warriors to whom the Emperor is literally divine, and for whom no oath is too absolute, and no act of battlefield worship too bloody when sworn in his name. Their whole inheritance is one of endless crusade, of piety transmuted into direct and merciless violence. Set such warriors against Fulgrim, and the result is not ambiguity. It is annihilatory holy war. No compromise, no interpretive subtlety, no space for administrative caution, while data is reconciled and meanings debated. If the Phoenician stands revealed before them as a corrupted son of the Emperor returned in serpentine splendor, the Black Templars will answer with the only language they respect: vow, chain blade, bolter flame, and martyrdom. That makes them invaluable as defenders and ruinous as heralds. Their reports, if they send any, would not read as measured strategic assessments. They would read as war sermons, denunciations, calls for extermination and sacred vengeance without limit. From there, the shockwave spreads outward into sector command, and it is there that the Imperial fault line begins to open. In earnest, governors, admirals, cardinal functionaries, chapter serfs, logisticians, ordnance ministers, and all the grey castes of men who keep the Imperium's wars supplied would be forced almost immediately into an impossible choice. Is Crucible an isolated nightmare, terrible but containable, another world among the millions already screaming beneath invasion? Or is it the first strike in a larger campaign centered upon a returned demon Primarch and a legion now moving with greater purpose than it has shown in ages? The official sources do not confirm the latter as established fact, but they certainly make the fear rational. Fulgrim's role is active. His sons are being rallied by his command. Crucible is a grueling siege, and his intentions extend beyond one planet. In practical terms, that means every sector authority near the zone of contagion must begin acting before certainty is available. And the Imperium is never more lethal than when it acts under uncertainty. Fulgrim's methods would worsen this crisis because they do not produce neat categories. Worlds under the shadow of the Emperor's children become difficult to classify, reinforce, or even describe in language safe for official circulation. Was a city taken or transformed? Is a regiment broken, contaminated, or merely demoralized? Are the survivors witnesses, liabilities, or vectors of spiritual infection? Is a shrine world still salvageable if its relics remain intact, but its population has spent months hearing the enemy's blasphemies sung through the ruins? Such questions matter because the Imperium depends upon categories. Categories determine tithes, relief, sanction, quarantine, and the movement of fleets. A world can be reinforced, purged, tithed, embargoed, or abandoned, but only once somebody somewhere dares to decide what has happened to it. Fulgrim's wars smear those boundaries. They create administrative chaos alongside battlefield chaos because they do not only damage matter, they unmake meaning. A world ravaged by orcs is terrible, but legible. A world touched by the Phoenician may still stand physically, while becoming impossible to process doctrinally. Imperial faith would react to that obscenity with violence almost at once. The Emperor's once favored son, returning not merely as traitor, but as a blasphemous parody of angelic majesty, would be symbolically unbearable to a civilization built on the sanctification of the Emperor's bloodline and the ritual condemnation of the heresy as primal sin. Fulgrim is especially intolerable because he was once beautiful in the old sense, one of the crafted demigods whose excellence was meant to testify to the Emperor's genius. To behold such a figure, now transformed into a demon primarch of excess, is to confront the possibility that the highest things can be inverted without losing any of their capacity to command awe. That cannot simply be understood within imperial religion. It must be exorcised. It must be denounced in sermons, purged from iconography, answered with relic processions, mass confessions, and public vows of vengeance. The Black Templars, with their creed of bloody worship and total devotion, stand as the perfect military expression of that instinct. But they would not be alone. Every confessor and shrine world cardinal who heard the reports would feel the pressure to react, not prudently, but absolutely. And that is where the body count begins to multiply, beyond the direct toll of war. Purges would follow rumors before facts. Quarantines would be declared upon worlds not yet touched because their traffic routes brush too close to the wrong systems. Emergency crusades would be raised by prelates who see in Fulgrim's return the vindication of every fiery warning they have ever screamed from the pulpit. Rival claims of authority would bloom overnight, sector commanders demanding measured response, ecclesiarchal authorities demanding sanctified extermination, chapters asserting autonomous right to prosecute the enemy without waiting for civil sanction, inquisitorial elements moving to suppress, seize, or silence evidence deemed spiritually destabilizing. None of this requires official confirmation in source text to be plausible. It is the ordinary grammar of imperial overreaction applied to an extraordinary provocation, and Fulgrim's presence is exactly the kind of provocation that turns every latent tension into active bloodletting, because he does not merely kill with blade and bombardment. He kills by making the Imperium convulse around the meaning of him. That symbolic dimension is what makes the threat so severe. A war against Fulgrim becomes unbearable to the Imperium, not only because of what he destroys, but because of what he represents. He embodies the desecration of old imperial ideals at the highest imaginable level. He is one of the Emperor's sons, and therefore one of the pillars upon which imperial myth was once built. His very form says that glory can be corrupted and still remain glorious to the eye. For ordinary soldiers, that is terrifying. For preachers, it is intolerable. For administrators, it is unmanageable. For the faithful masses, should the truth spread too widely, it is the kind of revelation that can drive some deeper into fanaticism and others straight into despair or forbidden fascination. That is why wars of this kind become so costly. The enemy is not just crossing borders. He is assaulting the story the Imperium tells about itself. And when the story begins to fail, the regime answers with fire. Crucible, therefore, matters not only as a battlefield, but as the first test of how violently the Imperium will react when confronted by the active return of the Phoenician. A Black Templar defense ensures the opening response is absolute. A grueling siege ensures the reports coming out will be prolonged, contradictory, and spiritually corrosive. Fulgrim's wider ambitions ensure that every authority receiving those reports must ask whether this is a local horror or the beginning of something much larger. In that uncertainty lies the true fault line, not simply between Imperium and traitor, but within the Imperium itself, between faith and procedure, between doctrinal purity and logistical necessity, between those who would quarantine, those who would crusade, those who would censor, and those who would exploit the crisis to enlarge their own mandates. So the coming struggle, should it widen, will not be a matter of the Imperium merely fighting Fulgrim. That would be almost merciful in its simplicity. It will be the Imperium attempting to define what Fulgrim means while under the pressure of his advance. And in that attempt, it will begin, as it always does, to tear at its own flesh. Every report suppressed too long, every panic purge, every rival command issued under the sign of emergency, every shrine world set ablaze to prevent contamination, every fleet diverted from one war to answer another, all of it becomes part of his harvest. The Phoenician may strike from without, but the empire he wounds is built in such a way that it will gladly deepen the cut itself, while arguing over whether the blood on its hands is sacred duty or shame. One of the most seductive falsehoods in all discussions of the damned is the assumption that what serves one ruinous power must by nature serve chaos entire. It is a child's simplification, the sort of error made by lesser clerks in frightened shrine offices and by mortal commanders who imagine the Eye of Terror to be a kingdom rather than a wound. This chapter must therefore be spoken in the register of theory, because no canon decree has yet unfurled the full political weather that will follow Fulgrim's rise. Yet theory is not the same thing as fancy. The official material already gives us the bones from which a darker anatomy may be inferred. Fulgrim is active once more in the 41st millennium. His sons have been set a challenge upon Crucible. Their war is a grueling siege rather than a passing raid. His ambitions reach beyond a single planet. The Emperor's children are framed as seekers of excess and sensation, not merely opportunistic marauders. From those things alone it becomes possible, even necessary, to ask a more difficult question. What if Fulgrim's ascent is not good news for chaos as a whole, but the beginning of a new struggle within the damned themselves? Begin with Abaddon, because all serious roads into the politics of chaos eventually do. Official Warhammer material has long framed him as the master of the Black Legion, the foremost champion of the Dark Gods, the architect of the assaults that helped bring about the Great Rift, and the one figure capable of uniting the forces of chaos against the Imperium in truly significant numbers. That matters, because a flamboyant Primarch-scale campaign led by Fulgrim would not merely spill blood in the Emperor's realm. It would draw worship, narrative gravity, military resources, and fearful attention towards Slaanesh and the Third Legion, at precisely the moment the War Master is supposed to remain the great focal point of the long war. No official source currently says that Abaddon has declared displeasure, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But if one accepts the official portrayal of him as the paramount unifier and chief tyrant of the traitor cause, then a resurgent Fulgrim gathering notoriety on that scale would be difficult for him to regard as neutral. It would look too much like a rival center of meaning, forming inside the war he has spent 10,000 years trying to dominate. That tension would not end with the Black Legion, because the traitor hosts are not one people with one appetite. They are old grudges chained to different gods, different humiliations, and different concepts of victory. The World Eaters are officially framed as creatures of direct and senseless violence, unsubtle and utterly committed to the immediate gospel of slaughter. The Death Guard are framed through Nurgle's creeping pall of disease, decay, and inevitable corruption, their wars carrying the patient certainty of contagion rather than the shrieking vanity of display. Place Fulgrim's wars beside those temperaments, and the friction becomes easy to imagine. The World Eaters would see decadence where they crave massacre. The Death Guard would see vanity where they prefer inevitability. The Black Legion, built around the War Master's long purpose, would see destabilizing ego in a campaign that threatens to become more about the Phoenician being witnessed than about chaos winning in any durable sense. These are interpretations, yes, but they grow directly from how the official material differentiates the major traitor powers. Fulgrim's very style of war invites that resentment, because it is not content to be merely effective. It must be seen to be exquisite. The Emperor's children are officially described as roaming the galaxy in pursuit of sensations beyond imagination, always seeking excess in battle and slaughtering their foes with ever more depraved methods, while Fulgrim himself is presented as a preening duelist and predator of vainglorious magnificence. That mode of warfare cannot help but rank worth. It rewards the memorable over the dutiful, the theatrical over the merely victorious, the singular atrocity over the anonymous strategic gain. Every siege becomes an audition. Every battlefield becomes a chamber in which warriors compete not only against the enemy, but against one another's ability to command attention. To Khorne's berserkers, this reeks of indulgence. To Nurgle's sons, it reeks of frivolity. To Abaddon's long planners, it reeks of a rival mythology swelling inside the larger war effort. In such a climate, rivalry is not an unfortunate byproduct. It is almost guaranteed, and once rivalry is invited into the heart of chaos, it does not remain ceremonial for long. It metastasizes into secondary fronts, often uglier than the main campaign, because they are prosecuted by killers who already know one another's tricks. Allied fleets may vanish into ambushes orchestrated by supposed friends. Assassination attempts may be mounted not only against Imperial commanders, but against rival champions growing too celebrated for comfort. Supply routes through warp-tainted corridors may be sabotaged, not to starve the Imperium, but to embarrass another traitor lord before his gods and followers. Whole campaigns may be launched out of pure spite, because one Primarch's triumphal progress has become unbearable to the pride of another warband or patron power. None of this is yet confirmed as present fact in the latest Fulgrim material. This remains speculation, but it is speculation entirely in keeping with the official history of Chaos Space Marines as heretic hosts shaped by pride, ambition, corruption, and a long war that has always contained as much rivalry within treason as hatred toward terror beyond it. This is one of the clearest routes by which the phrase "bloodiest war since the Heresy" begins to sound less like sensationalism and more like a plausible nightmare. Not because the official material has declared such a war, for it has not. It would be false to claim canon has already crowned Fulgrim's return with so immense a title. But if a Fulgrim-centered resurgence provokes not only imperial reaction and Emperor's Children expansion, but also retaliatory turbulence within chaos itself, then the arithmetic of slaughter changes drastically. A war that includes chaos devouring chaos is always bloodier than the tidy projections of campaign maps. Every convoy struck by supposed allies, every warband annihilated for insolence, every fleet duel between rival servants of the same damnation multiplies casualties without advancing any front in the conventional sense. It produces ruin for the sake of prestige, wrath, and metaphysical offense. That is how body counts begin to resemble civil war, even when no formal civil war has been declared. The echo of the heresy must be handled carefully here. This would not be that war again. The old age of brother against brother, of half the legions turning in open rebellion beneath Horus, was singular in both cause and scale. Official overviews of chaos history still frame that apocalyptic civil war as the foundational catastrophe from which the Long War emerged. Yet one can still hear a resemblance without confusing the songs. What made the heresy so unbearable was not only its magnitude, but the fact that the greatest killers in the Imperium could not stop warring among themselves even when their common objectives should have demanded coherence. A Fulgrim-driven age of conflict could echo that pattern without reproducing it exactly. It would be another era in which transhuman demigods and their heirs, gifted with the power to unmake sectors, repeatedly choose rivalry, self-worship, and vendetta over any disciplined pursuit of final victory. That is a heresy-shaped wound, even if the blade entering it is different. Indeed, there is every reason to suspect that Fulgrim might welcome such fraternal hatred rather than fear it. This too is theory, but it is theory consistent with everything the official material says about his legion and its appetites. The Emperor's children seek sensation beyond imagination. Fulgrim's plans stretch beyond simple conquest. His sons are driven to question what they will sacrifice for his favor, while turning their weapons inward as well as outward. A being like that need not regard resentment from rival traitors as a threat in the ordinary sense. Hatred is still attention. Rivalry is still proof of significance. To force Angren's sons into disgust, Mortarian's plague hosts into contempt, and Abaddon's chosen into cold political calculation would itself be a kind of triumph. It would mean the Phoenician had become central again, the point around which others were compelled to orient their rage. For a creature of vanity elevated into demonic principle, that may be nourishment enough. There is an even darker possibility. Chaos infighting may not simply be collateral to Fulgrim's rise. It may be one of the engines by which he sharpens his own. Every rival offended by his spectacle helps raise the emotional temperature of the wider conflict. Every retaliatory strike gives him another insult to answer in grander fashion. Every assassination plot and fleet sabotage gives his sons another opportunity to prove themselves by surviving, retaliating, and turning spite into opera. In that environment, the Emperor's children become more dangerous precisely because they are contested. Pressure selects, rivalry refines. Those who endure such an atmosphere are not the prudent or the cooperative, but the memorable, the ruthless, and the obscenely adaptive. Thus, chaos trying to humble Fulgrim might instead help temper the blade he is forging from his shattered legion. That possibility should trouble anyone who imagines internal traitor conflict automatically weakens the enemy in a meaningful way. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it only teaches monsters to bite harder. So the chaos problem is this. The Long War has always depended upon a paradox. It requires enough unity to threaten the Imperium, and enough rivalry to remain recognizably chaotic. Abaddon has, by official framing, been the chief manager of that paradox for 10,000 years, the one champion capable of making the damned move in rough concert when it matters most. A resurgent Fulgrim threatens to unbalance that arrangement, not because he offers a cleaner alternative, but because he offers something far more dangerous to the diseased imaginations of traitors and cultists alike. He offers splendor. He offers a fresh center of fascination. He offers a war that promises not merely plunder or strategic gain, but participation in a spectacle large enough to bruise the whole age. If enough of the damned turn their faces toward that radiance, then the Long War will not end. It will warp. It will bend under the gravitational pull of one Primarch's vanity until old alliances strain, rival gods bristle, and every victory risks becoming another fracture. Then the galaxy will witness not a second heresy, but something close enough in spirit to chill the blood of anyone who remembers what happens when the greatest murderers alive cannot stop competing for the right to define the age. The Long War itself may begin to buckle beneath the weight of Fulgrim's impossible ego. War in the 41st millennium is fought with munitions, prayer, starvation, attrition, and the slow murder of logistics. But those things are only the lower machinery. Beneath them lies something older and far more decisive. Imagination. Men do not merely die according to what guns can kill them. They die according to what they believe the age has become. That is why Primarchs matter beyond all sensible proportion. They do not simply alter campaigns by adding another supreme commander to the tally of war. They alter the symbolic weather of the entire setting. When Robut Guilliman returned, official imperial framing treated it as a showstopper event, the impossible becoming real at the hour of greatest need. When Lion L. Johnson stepped back into the age, he too was presented as a lost son of the Emperor, returning from history into humanity's darkest necessity. Now Fulgrim is likewise being presented as returned to active relevance in the 41st millennium, not as archived dust or inherited terror, but as a living force shaping current events. Each such return teaches the galaxy the same lesson in a new tongue. Myth is not dead, and it can still kill you. For common soldiers, that distinction is everything. A commander can be understood. A general may inspire fear, reverence, or resentment, but he remains within the categories by which ordinary men endure war. He can be outmaneuvered, misreported, assassinated, delayed by fuel shortage, or ignored until the artillery solution arrives. A Primarch is different. The appearance of Fulgrim upon a battlefield would not register in the soul of a line trooper as the arrival of another strategic mind. It would register as the arrival of myth in physically hostile form. Not story as comfort, but story made carnivorous. Official descriptions of Fulgrim emphasize precisely this transfigured grandeur, a demon Primarch of terrible glory and magnificence, a grotesque manifestation of the fall of the once noble Emperor's children. That language matters because it tells us how he is meant to be seen, not merely as dangerous, but as impossibly significant. To stand beneath such a presence is to feel that one has not entered a harder battle, but a different order of reality. Morale breaks. Differently under that kind of pressure. Men have always feared monsters, but fear is magnified when the monster was once one of the Emperor's own sons. Imperial doctrine has spent 10,000 years embalming the Primarchs in a mixture of sanctity, censorship, and selective remembrance. They are treated as lost exemplars, shattered pillars of a golden age, proof that the Emperor once strode among a breed of beings greater than common flesh. To hear that such a figure now returns not as savior, but as serpentine blasphemy is not merely to receive bad military news. It is to feel a doctrinal beam crack above one's head. Before formal combat even begins, before the first bastion is breached, or the first sonic shriek peels skin from bone, the knowledge alone can shatter confidence. An enemy who was always a demon may be hated. An enemy who was once a son of the Emperor forces the mind toward far more dangerous questions. Recent official framing leans into exactly that inversion by describing Fulgrim as the manifestation of the great fall of the Emperor's once favored legion. Yet terror never travels alone in an age of returned legends. Rumor of loyalist response would spread almost as fast as dread itself, because every theater touched by a Primarch invites immediate speculation about another. Guilliman's return has already taught the Imperium that impossible rescues can happen. The Lion's return has reinforced the lesson. Once a battlefield is marked by one of the Emperor's sons, minds across nearby sectors begin asking whether another will answer. Will Guilliman intervene? Will the Lion turn his hunt toward this new obscenity? Will some other ancient power emerge from the sealed vault of history to balance the scales? Official Warhammer framing around the Loyalist returns has made those figures into symbols of guidance, rescue, and hunted retribution. It follows that Fulgrim's active re-entry into the Age would ignite not only panic, but expectation. The ravenous hope that myths may be answered only by counter-myths. That kind of hope is dangerous, because it grows strongest exactly where certainty is weakest. This is how a campaign is dragged upward into a more heresy-like psychological register, even before any true comparison of scale becomes justified. The old civil war was intolerable, not only because of its slaughter, but because the galaxy was forced to think in the dimensions of demigods. Whole crusades revolved around where the Primarchs were, what they intended, whether they might meet, and which world would be reduced to legend merely by hosting their wrath for a few burning hours. Recent official material surrounding the returns of Guilliman, the Lion and Fulgrim, does not declare a new heresy, nor should anyone claim it does, but it does restore that larger psychological altitude. Campaigns cease to be solely about ports, manufactoria, and fleet lanes. They become charged by the possibility that impossible beings may cross paths. Even the rumor of such an encounter can dominate how whole wars are remembered before they are even won. And that expectation alters strategy, propaganda, and morale across multiple sectors, even if no Primarch duel is ever confirmed. This is an inference, but a sound one. If commanders believe a theater may draw the gaze of Guilliman, they reinforce it differently, report upon it differently, and feed it into the machinery of imperial hope with greater urgency. If traitor warlords believe Fulgrim's attention has made a war zone symbolically charged, they may flock there for prestige, avoid it out of rivalry, or attempt to poison it for their own purposes. Shrine worlds begin sermonizing around the possibility of deliverance or damnation. Astropathic choirs weight their transmissions with more fear. Civil authorities censor harder because they know a Primarch-touched campaign can trigger panic beyond its borders. The mere possibility of godlike confrontation changes behavior long before the first godlike blow is struck. Official sources do not need to spell out every consequence for the pattern to be visible. Their own treatment of these returns as major, era-shaping events is evidence enough of the symbolic charge involved. Fulgrim, perhaps more than any of his returned brothers, benefits from this economy of attention. Every whispered comparison to Guilliman grants him stature. Every fearful question about whether the lion must answer him drapes him in greater consequence. Every sermon that names him as a corruption of former glory spreads his image further. This is part of what makes his return so poisonous. He is not merely a military threat gathering armies and sieges around himself. He is a symbol that grows by being discussed. Official material already frames him in grand terms as a monstrously magnificent centerpiece, a demon Primarch returning to the active setting, a figure whose renewed presence directly impacts the Emperor's children and their ambitions. In such a climate, even those who oppose him help enlarge him. To compare him to his brothers is to restore him to the same mythic scale, and that restoration itself is a form of victory for a being whose vanity has always required a galaxy-sized mirror. That is one reason his return matters more than any single rules tome, campaign notice, or isolated chronicle could ever contain. Those things may announce, describe, or dramatize the event, but they are not the event itself. The event is the shift in the galaxy's self-understanding, once another Primarch begins exerting force upon the present tense of history. Official previews around Fulgrim have tied his new model, the Emperor's Children range, and Fulgrim, the perfect son, directly to his return to the 41st millennium. That combined framing signals something larger than a passing vignette. It tells the audience inside and outside the fiction alike that a new symbolic center has entered the field. When a Primarch returns, he stops being merely a character in a story and becomes instead one of the lenses through which all nearby stories are interpreted. That is why his arrival cannot be contained within one world, one siege, or one publication. It changes what surrounding wars mean. A galaxy already living in the wake of returned legends may not survive another such return cleanly. That is not prophecy. It is the logical weight of accumulated symbolism. Guilliman's reappearance gave the Imperium a stern architecture of hope. The Lions added a myth of sudden redemptive violence, of the old knights stepping from darkness to strike in humanity's need. Fulgrim offers the inversion of both. He proves that return is not inherently restorative. He proves that the old age can re-enter the present in poisoned form. The setting can absorb one such contradiction only by becoming more unstable under the strain. Two loyalist legends already walk the age. If now a traitor brother of equal mythic magnitude begins asserting himself as well, then every campaign touched by that fact risks swelling beyond its practical boundaries. The galaxy must not only fight another Primarch, it must learn to think with another Primarch loose inside its nightmares. This is also why even distant worlds begin to change once word spreads. Men on planets that Fulgrim may never personally behold will start fighting in the shadow of what he represents. Commissars will harden discipline because the old stories are walking again. Preachers will thunder more violently because the age of demigods no longer feels sealed in scripture. Traitor cults will swell with fresh excitement, convinced they are living at the lip of another mythic convulsion. A manufacturum overseer deciding whether to release reserve stocks, a chapter master choosing which warfront may be abandoned, a fleet captain electing whether to break formation and pursue glory, all these decisions begin to warp under the pressure of Primarch-scale narrative. That is the true shockwave. Not only the tremor where Fulgrim stands, but the imaginative aftershocks felt by millions who will never see him and yet begin acting as though the old order of the universe has shifted under their boots. The official emphasis on these returns as momentous, setting-level developments supports exactly this broader reading of their consequence. In the end, the scale of such a war is not measured only when fleets mass or hive cities burn. Those are the visible symptoms. The deeper measure begins earlier and spreads farther. It begins when ordinary men start fighting, as if the age of gods has come back. When trench soldiers grip their rifles not against an enemy host alone, but against the possibility that one of the Emperor's sons may soon darken the horizon. When traitor champions commit atrocities with greater flourish because they believe a Primarch's gaze may sanctify their excess. When sector authorities make ruinous decisions because legend has intruded into logistics. That is when the true scale begins. Not at the moment a Primarch kills, but at the moment the existence of a Primarch makes millions of lesser beings live, fear, pray, and butcher differently. Fulgrim's return matters because it does exactly that. It makes the galaxy remember that the old impossible beings were never safely buried in the past, and once enough people act on that memory, the war is already larger than the battlefield that first announced it. To understand a Fulgrim war, only in terms of objectives taken and fleets committed, is to miss the filthiest part of it. Such wars must be understood as they are experienced by the men trapped inside them. Not from the height of a tactica display where symbols slide across hololithic stars in obedient silence, but from the trench mouth, the Vox bunker, the Hab corridor full of dust and incense and blood, where the enemy does not merely arrive but intrudes into the nerves. The official framing of the Emperor's children already points toward this mode of battle. They pursue transcendent sensations, decadent slaughter, illicit combat drugs, arrogant dueling, and an outright assault on the senses, while Fulgrim himself is presented as a serpentine monstrosity who seeks challenge, wields demonic poisons, and carries a beguiling aura into war. On the ground, that means a battlefield that feels wrong before it becomes lost. Sonic annihilation is the first and most obvious sign of that wrongness. Official material describes noise marines as playing torturous threnodies, with sonic weapons that shatter psyches and rattle flesh and armor to pieces. That is not ordinary bombardment described in florid language. It implies warfare in which the body is attacked through vibration, overstimulation, and panic as much as through impact and heat. A wall hit by artillery may crumble in a comprehensible way. A line struck by such sonic violence comes apart in the mind as well as the flesh. Teeth burst from gums. Vision trembles. Organs spasm. Men forget whether they are hearing a weapon, a hymn, or the final tearing of their own senses. Under such pressure, the battlefield ceases to obey the old distinction between material and emotional damage, because both are broken at once. Then comes the haze. The newest Codex preview explicitly notes the Legion's stash of illicit combat drugs, while other official descriptions dwell on sensation, thrill-seeking, and the willingness to embrace pain that would slay lesser beings. Taken together, the implication is a style of war saturated by stimulants, poisons, and altered states, not just among the attackers, but as a pressure imposed upon the wider theatre. Even where the Emperor's children are not literally poisoning the air, their very conduct has the effect of intoxication. Battle rhythm becomes erratic. The enemy strikes too fast, withdraws too gracefully, reappears at angles that seem to violate common sense, and fights with a rapture that reads to defenders as insanity. On the ground, this produces the feeling of combat inside a narcotic dream, where timing is ruined, reactions lag, and discipline begins to feel clumsy against something unnaturally fluid. Their duels are no less corrupting. Official sources repeatedly emphasize the Emperor's children as famed duelists, peerless bladesmen, and supremely arrogant swordsmen, while Fulgrim himself is cast as a preening duelist, hunting challenges worthy of his attention. This matters because surgical violence changes the emotional geometry of a battlefield. A line can endure shelling. It can even endure massacre for a time, if massacre remains impersonal. But when champions begin stepping through the ruin to isolate officers, standard bearers, confessors, and veteran sergeants with theatrical precision, fear changes character. Men cease to feel they are part of a unit under attack and begin to feel individually selected. The battlefield becomes intimate in the worst possible way. The wound is no longer collective only, it is curated. The enemy is not merely trying to win the field, he is trying to make examples beautiful enough to be remembered. This is why the Emperor's children do not merely break lines, they deform the emotional reality of the battlefield itself. Their agility, thrill-seeking movement, and emphasis on spectacle mean they do not press like ordinary assault troops, nor grind like attritional siege masters. They flow, redirect, seek fresh morsels, and indulge in chosen aspects of war that range from dueling to pain revelry to demonic carnival. The result, as an inference from the official material, is that defenders are denied the psychological comfort of pattern. They cannot easily determine whether the enemy wants the manufactorum, the bridgehead, the shrine district, or simply the most humiliating angle from which to expose them. Military logic is still present, but it is wrapped in the habits of appetite. That makes every action feel partly rational and partly insane, which is often more frightening than outright madness. So cities under assault become stages. Vox nets are not merely jammed but hijacked, turned into channels for shrieking harmonics, boasts, taunts, and the weaponized intimacy of the enemy's voice. Monuments are not only toppled, but defaced with exquisite malice, altered in ways meant to insult memory rather than simply erase it. Cathedrals become resonance chambers where faith itself is made to vibrate against stone until prayer sounds like suffering. Corpses are not left as waste, but arranged as statements, trophies, punchlines, or obscene works of devotion. This is an interpretive extension of the official line that the Emperor's children seek excess, dramatic flourishes, decadent slaughter, and war as self-expression. But it is exactly where that logic leads once translated from faction identity into urban siege. The city is no longer a target alone, it is scenery. That theatrical mode of war creates disproportionate panic because the defenders cannot easily process what sort of enemy they are facing. If the foe behaves with pure strategic cruelty, then the mind can at least hate him cleanly. If he behaves with pure lunacy, then one may cling to the hope that madness will eventually overreach. The Emperor's children are worse because they combine tactical competence, transhuman skill, and battlefield mobility with what appears, from the trench level, to be artistic psychosis. Official material presents them as skilled warriors all, enhanced by ceaseless conflict, yet driven by sensation, arrogant boasts, internal rivalries, and the hope of proving themselves to their patron. The defender therefore confronts a force that is competent enough to kill him and unstable enough to terrify him beyond doctrine. That combination spreads panic faster than casualty figures alone would suggest. Prolonged exposure to such warfare corrodes more than morale. It corrodes discipline, faith, and identity, even among units that do not physically break. This is inference, but it is strongly supported by the official shape of the Legion's warfare. Troops who survive day after day beneath sonic assault, taunting vox pollution, impossible speed, staged mutilations, and the constant sense of being watched as part of someone else's performance do not emerge unchanged. Drills feel stupid, prayer feels fragile. Command language begins to sound thin beside the enemy's overwhelming sensory confidence. Some men become harder and more fanatical, Others become numb. Others begin, in shame, to feel fascination. This is how contamination begins on the human level, not always through conversion, but through erosion. A soldier need not kneel to Slanesh to carry the war home inside his mind. For that reason, Fulgrim's campaigns likely produce an unusually high ratio of collateral horror to strategic footprint. A world may lose fewer districts than it would to an Orc War or a Hive Fleet splinter, and still suffer damage more lasting in civic, spiritual, and psychological terms. Official sources already frame the Emperor's children as an all-out assault on the senses, as warriors pursuing excess in battle, and as a force whose wars are inseparable from display, drugs, dueling, and corrupted glamour. That implies campaigns whose aftershocks exceed their formal conquest. The strategic map may show one city taken, one corridor denied, one shrine hive crippled. The lived aftermath may instead include mass breakdowns, doctrinal purges, unstable populations, copycat cults, scarred communications networks and institutions, no longer certain how to describe what they endured. And cult activity will bloom in the wake of such invasion, not only through ideology, but through trauma and fascination. This is again an inference, yet it follows directly from the official depiction of the Legion as seekers of sensation, and from the way their battlefield methods fuse splendor with depravity. Some survivors will seek harder forms of purity and reaction, begging for purges and stricter devotions. Others will dream of what they saw. They will replay the shriek of the sonic blast, the impossible grace of the bladesman, the intoxicating defiance with which the enemy seemed to treat pain and law alike. In a civilization as spiritually unstable as the Imperium, fascination is often the first catechism of corruption. One does not need pamphlets when memory itself has become seductive. Thus, the Emperor's children become ideal agents of civilizational contamination. Too swift to contain neatly, too strange to classify bureaucratically, and too cruel to be forgotten once encountered. This is how one Primarch-led offensive can generate multiple wars afterward, even on worlds never fully conquered. A city merely raided may still require years of purge and reconsecration. Regiment that technically survived may become unusable, because its officers distrust the men who heard too much and lived. A trade route reopened after the enemy's withdrawal may carry not only goods, but rumors, cultic residues, and a taste for transgression born from terror. Official material tells us Fulgrim's plans go beyond a single planet and presents his legion as a foregrounded force once more, driven by excess, rivalry, and the desire to be seen. The wider inference is unavoidable. Their wars do not end when they depart. They leave behind social rot that keeps fighting in their absence. That is why the bloodiest wars are not always the ones that open with the largest bombardments or the most spectacular fleet engagements. Sometimes the deadliest wars are the ones that poison everything they touch. They leave fewer neat battle honors and more quarantined districts, more broken doctrines, more secret compulsions, more men who survived the breach only to carry its echo into 10 other worlds. Fulgrim's wars, if the current official portrayal of his legion is any guide, belong to that class. They kill by blade, by shriek, by poison, and by seduction, but they also kill by making ordinary reality less stable wherever they pass. And once a war begins doing that, the tally of its victims can no longer be measured only in the bodies found where the first walls fell. This is where the comparison to the Heresy must be handled with a steady hand, and not with the grasping hysteria of a vox preacher scenting apocalypse in every plume of smoke. To say that Fulgrim's return could make the coming war feel like the Heresy is not to say that history is about to repeat itself in perfect form. There will be no simple mirror held up to that first great sundering, no clean second act in which old banners rise in the same places and brother slays brother according to the same script. The resemblance lies elsewhere. It lies in scale of consequence, in symbolic violence, in the old sickness of fraternal rupture, and in the dreadful way a conflict can swell beyond strategy until it begins to alter the meaning of the age around it. That is where the heresy still lives, not as a template to be copied, but as the primal wound whose logic keeps returning in new flesh. Fulgrim's current re-entry into the active life of the 41st millennium, and the fact that official material now ties him directly to the Emperor's children, Crucible, and ambitions beyond one world, is what makes that echo worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing as theatrical excess. And the tone you anchored from the uploaded notes is exactly the right one for understanding why. The real gravity of a Fulgrim war would not lie only in the first invasion, the first head taken, the first cathedral city defiled beneath shrieking skies. It would lie in the fallout, in the administrative rot that follows, the memorials erected too quickly, the explanations forced into shape before. The blood on the stones has even dried. It would matter in the bitter work of those left behind, those broken officials, chapter serfs, confessors, survivors, logisticians, and gravekeepers who must turn an incomprehensible atrocity into an archive entry, a penitential rite, a revised command structure, a tale the Imperium can survive hearing. That was one of the great truths of the heresy, and it would be one of the great truths here as well. The worst wars are not ended by victory. They are inherited. They are processed by institutions already too exhausted to process them honestly. They are translated into doctrine by people whose first concern is not truth, but continuity. That is why a Fulgrim war would feel so old at once, because it would force the Imperium back into its oldest talent, making ruin livable by naming it sacred. That is also why the line between military campaign and civilizational self-harm would blur so quickly. A war against Fulgrim could begin with fleets and sieges, but it would not remain there for long. The Emperor's children do not merely conquer. They profane, they infect memory, they force witnesses to keep carrying what they have seen long after the battlefield itself has gone cold. The Imperium, for its part, answers such injuries not with calm recovery, but with convulsion. It purges, it censors, it sanctifies. It turns uncertainty into violent orthodoxy, because uncertainty is one thing the regime has never learned to endure. In such a contest, every attempt to preserve order risks becoming another wound. Every effort to defend faith risks proving how brittle that faith has become. Whole institutions may survive materially, their walls intact, their ledgers preserved, their hierarchies still issuing commands, while dying inwardly of shame, fanaticism, contradiction, and the slow poisoning of memory. That, more than any single battle, is what makes the heresy comparison apt. In both cases, truth is beaten into myth almost. Immediately, it does not even have time to rest as fact. The event occurs, and at once the machinery begins. Witnesses disagree, records are sealed, sermons multiply, heroic interpretations are carved into stone before the ashes have settled. The old war taught the Imperium how to survive catastrophe by ritualizing it, and the cost of that lesson was honesty. One does not preserve an empire of this size and this fear by telling people exactly what happened. One preserves it by giving them forms in which to endure what happened. A monument, a martyr cult, a sanctioned phrase, a prayer over the dead that promises purpose where no sane eye can find any. That is why the emotional register of aftermath matters so much. It is the hour in which the truth is strangled and dressed for public life. The survivors of such a war would not feel like victors in any noble sense. They would feel like custodians of damage. Men and transhumans alike would move through the ruins, not as conquerors of evil, but as keepers of a wreckage too large to name. They would sort relics from body parts, oaths from lies, supply routes from grave roads. They would build narratives over rubble, because they would have no other choice. A shrine district cleansed after sonic desecration would need a meaning. A fortress monastery that held but lost half its gene stock would need a meaning. A world whose defenders did not break yet can no longer pray without hearing echoes in the stone would need a meaning. That is how myth grows in the Imperium. Not because everyone is foolish, but because reality in its raw state is too spiritually corrosive to leave exposed. And of all the traitor primarchs, Fulgrim may be the one most fitted to produce this specific kind of devastation. Others desecrate the Emperor's dream by destroying its structures. Fulgrim desecrates it by corrupting one of its ideals from within. He was once refinement, martial excellence, beauty under discipline, impossible standards. Made flesh. Official material still frames his present form in direct relation to that great fall, a grotesque manifestation of the ruin of the once noble Emperor's children. That is what makes his return symbolically unbearable. He is not merely a demon prince clawing at the edges of mankind's empire. He is the corruption of something once held close to the Emperor's own hand. His existence says that splendor itself can be inverted and made to serve appetite without losing its power to enthrall. He does not only kill loyal men, he humiliates the old imperial imagination. This is why strategic outcomes, while still important, cannot be the only measure. A sector can hold and still come away spiritually maimed. A chapter can survive and still lose the shape of its certainty. A shrine world can remain in imperial hands and yet require generations of purgation, because the faithful have begun asking the wrong questions in the wrong dark hours. Emotional wreckage in this setting is not decorative, it is infrastructure. It shapes what can still be believed, what can still be commanded, what can still be mourned without inviting collapse. The Heresy taught that long ago. Its final horror was not merely that billions died, but that the institutions left standing had to refound themselves on trauma, denial, and religious necessity. A Fulgrim war would threaten something similar in miniature, or perhaps in terrible expansion. It would bleed doctrine, memory, and legitimacy as surely as it would bleed bodies. That is why the phrase "bloodiest war," since the Heresy can make sense, even before one begins counting corpses in the strict military fashion. A war is bloodier in the broadest grimdark sense when it drains the meanings that let a civilization persist, when it turns memory into propaganda, legitimacy into reflex, and grief into a managed sacrament, when what survives is forced to survive by lying about the shape of its own wound. The Black Library synopsis for Fulgrim. The perfect sun already gives us the outline of a conflict that pushes naturally in that direction. A scattered legion, a world set aflame, a grueling siege, internecine violence, and plans that extend beyond one planet. Those are not the ingredients of a clean campaign. They are the ingredients of a conflict whose consequences will outrun its opening battlefield. So yes, this feels like the Heresy, but not because history is foolish enough to repeat itself in identical form. It feels like the Heresy because the old pattern is visible again. Demigod suns forcing the galaxy to think in mythic terms, institutions cracking under symbolic strain, truth collapsing into sanctioned narrative, and survivors left to inhabit a future built from useful fictions and exhausted devotion. That old civil war never truly ended in the deeper sense. It merely lost the convenience of open banners and learned to echo in different shapes. Fulgrim's return may simply be the latest of those. Echoes, beautiful in outline, obscene in substance, and loud enough that the whole age must hear in it the sound of an older wound splitting open once more. Assume the worst, because this age has earned no gentler habit. Assume Crucible falls. Assume the fires gutter out only after the walls are split, the reliquaries opened, the defenders butchered or dragged away in chains of shrieking triumph, and the head demanded by the Phoenician is at last lifted dripping before his gaze. Assume further that the Emperor's children do not interpret this as one victory among many, but as revelation. Fulgrim has set them a challenge upon an imperial world, has bound their ambition to his notice, and the official account already tells us that his plans run far beyond the conquest of a single planet. If that first furnace yields success, then its lesson to his sons will be hideously simple. Greater campaigns purchase greater proximity. Greater atrocities win greater attention. The road to the Father lies not through restraint, nor through patient accumulation, but through escalation so memorable that it cannot be ignored. That is the moment a single victory stops being local and becomes magnetic. The Emperor's children are officially framed as a once glorious legion, now broken into disparate warbands, scattered sons and competing egos, long denied what they regard as their birthright. A triumph at Crucible, especially one visibly linked to Fulgrim's approval, would act upon that fragmentation like a signal lantern raised above a corpse-strewn sea. Splinter princes lurking in warp shoals, decadent fleet tyrants squandering strength on petty predation, duelists who have spent decades carving their names into unimportant worlds, all would see in such a victory the same invitation. Come closer, bring your blades, bring your shrieking choirs, your chem masters, your relic vaults, your body slaves, and your vanity. The center is forming again. The old radiance is becoming visible in the void. In a legion starved for meaning and approbation, that may be summons enough. From there, the choice of future targets becomes a catalogue of temptations rather than a neat strategic ladder. Shrine worlds would call to the Emperor's children because the profanation of sanctity has always tasted sweeter to them than mere slaughter. A world where the faithful gather in their millions, where incense rises through cathedral vaults and every stone is heavy with piety, offers not only bodies to break, but symbols to unmake. Forge worlds would beckon for different reasons, rich in armaments, engines, slave stocks, and the industrial dignity that Fulgrim's sons so delight in corrupting into screaming artifice. Fortress planets of prestige would tempt the Legion's duelists and would be champions alike, because the harder the wall, the sweeter the humiliation when it falls. Even worlds devoted to pleasure, nobility, or luxury in the imperial sense would offer another kind. A feast, rich in vanity, excess, and the chance to turn imperial decadence into open Slaneshi revelation. This is speculation, yes, but it is speculation rooted in the official identity of the Emperor's children as seekers of excess, sensation, spectacle, and symbolic conquest, rather than mere practical gain. The Imperium, faced with such widening appetites, would be driven almost at once into ugly choices, from which no clean honor could be salvaged. This is not the kind of enemy one answers by simply reinforcing every threatened line, because the Imperium has never possessed the abundance its propaganda pretends. To save one route is to thin another. To fortify one shrine nexus is to expose some forge district, whose output may in turn be needed 3 sectors away. If Fulgrim's wars begin selecting targets for symbolic, spiritual and theatrical yield rather than for pure strategic necessity, then Imperial Command is forced to think in 2 incompatible registers at once. It must ask what can be held and what can be afforded, while also asking what can be allowed to fall without shattering morale across half a segmentum. In such dilemmas, empires bleed themselves. Worlds are abandoned not because they are worthless, but because saving them might imperil something judged even more indispensable. That is how escalation breeds bitterness faster than conquest alone ever could. Should the Black Templars die gloriously upon Crucible, the result may be worse still. Official material frames them as the most zealous of all the chapters, warriors to whom the Emperor is a literal deity, and for whom concepts such as mercy and forgiveness are anathema. Such men do not perish quietly in the imperial imagination. They become oath and relic. Their dead become warrants for broader vengeance. One doomed defense, if witnessed or retold in the proper register of sanctified rage, could harden into a call for crusade far beyond the original theatre. Pilgrim routes would carry the story. Chapter keeps would receive it as challenge. Ecclesiarchs would thunder that the emperor's holy warriors had bled beneath the gaze of a corrupted sun, and that the stain could be answered only by fire on a wider scale. Martyrdom in the Imperium is never passive, it recruits, and Fulgrim thrives precisely where every side begins to believe escalation is a moral necessity. That is the environment most suited to his corruption. The Emperor's children already seek distinction through excess. The Black Templars answer obscenity with absolute war. Imperial institutions faced with doctrinal outrage respond by multiplying force, censure, and sacrifice. Rival traitors, if drawn in, would see prestige, insult, or opportunity in the swelling spectacle. Every participant becomes convinced that he is now compelled to go further than he had intended, because to stop short would be weakness, impiety, or humiliation. This is how a campaign stops being a military problem and becomes a furnace for compulsions. Fulgrim does not need to calm such forces. He need only preen within them, redirect them, and give them enough beauty and ruin that each new excess seems like the inevitable answer to the last. There is also the darker possibility that even the wider leadership of chaos would be compelled to intervene once such a war grew too large to ignore. No official source yet announces that outcome, and it must remain in the realm of theory. Yet the logic is plain enough. A Fulgrim-centered conflagration that begins drawing fleets, worship, sectors of attention, and rival traumas into its orbit ceases to be a private indulgence of the Third Legion. It becomes a distortion in the greater balance of the long war. Abaddon could scarcely ignore a Primarch-scale spectacle that threatened to reshape the focus of traitor ambition. Nor would other God-sworn hosts necessarily endure endless Slaaneshi theatre without seeking to profit from it, punish it, or redirect it. What begins as an Emperor's Children offensive could therefore widen by reaction alone, with chaos entering not as one unified reinforcement, but as a swarm of competing interventions. That is the point at which the war changes species. It is no longer merely Fulgrim and his sons testing a world, nor even Fulgrim and the Imperium grinding one another down through siege, counter-crusade, and sacrilege. It becomes catastrophe, with multiple hungers feeding at once. The shrine worlds burn, while forge worlds choke, and fortress moons crack their dock rings in frantic musters. Black Templar zeal draws in other crusading forces, some noble, some foolish, some arriving too late and dying gloriously for no gain at all. Cults bloom behind the front, where survivors cannot decide whether what they witnessed was horror, revelation, or both. Rival traitor captains strike one another's convoys under the cover of imperial confusion. The war front no longer has a clean edge. It frays into 100 tributaries of slaughter, each claiming necessity, each deepening the wound. Seen at that scale, the shape of the thing becomes almost apocalyptic. Cathedral sieges under shrieking skies, poisoned stars whose shipping lanes carry plague, panic, and heresy in equal measure. Cultic uprisings in places the Emperor's children never fully occupied, because memory of their passage was enough to loosen the soul. Brother killing brother among the traitors, and institution devouring institution among the loyalists, each side insisting that its fratricide is regrettable but required. Sectors stripped down to screaming ruin, not because every planet was conquered, but because every planet was forced to choose, divert, sacrifice, purge, or despair in answer to the same widening crisis. The official sources do not yet say that this future has come to pass, but they already supply the architecture for it. Fulgrim returned to active relevance, a legion recalled from fragmentation, Crucible as testing ground, and designs that run beyond one world. This is why the worst case must be contemplated plainly, not to indulge hysteria, but because there are wars whose opening victory contains inside it a method for indefinite growth. If Fulgrim learns from Crucible that worlds can be made into auditions, that rivals can be sharpened by competition rather than ruined by it, that imperial zeal can be manipulated into self-destructive overcommitment, and that every atrocity committed in his name makes the galaxy look harder in his direction, then there is no reason for the scale to stop where prudence would have stopped it. Prudence is for mortals who fear depletion. Fulgrim seeks perfection in sensation, acknowledgement, and ruin. Once war itself becomes the stage upon which he pursues that perfection, there is no natural ceiling to its size. Yes, it could. But that judgment must be spoken with the discipline this subject demands, because the cleanest answer is not the same thing as a reckless. 1. Fulgrim's return could ignite the bloodiest war since the Heresy, yet that remains a reasoned theory rather than a confirmed official outcome. The canon, as it stands, does not proclaim that such a war has already begun, nor does it crown Crucible as the first battlefield of some formally declared second age of civil apocalypse. What it does confirm is dangerous enough without embellishment. Fulgrim has been brought back into active relevance in the 41st millennium. The Emperor's children have returned to the foreground as a major force with a new codex, new range, and a narrative center strong enough to pull the setting's attention toward them. Crucible is not framed as a throwaway atrocity, but as a grueling siege in which Fulgrim's sons are commanded to take an imperial world, bring him the head of the Black Templar leading its defense, and contend with designs that reach beyond one planet. That is the strongest canon spine, and it is already enough to justify dread. The Black Library synopsis does not describe a quick raid concluded in one gesture of decadent savagery. It describes a prolonged war, a world in flames, a legion turning its weapons inward as well as outward, and a Primarch whose intentions extend past the immediate conquest before him. Warhammer Community strengthens that spine by explicitly tying Fulgrim, the perfect son, to his return to the 41st millennium, and by presenting the Emperor's children not as half-remembered raiders, but as a force now making a decisive move of its own. In other words, the question is no longer whether Fulgrim matters in the present age. It is how widely the matter of him will spread. The first bridge from canon into broader catastrophe is therefore speculative, but it is not fragile speculation. It is the possibility that Fulgrim can reorient the scattered remnants of the Emperor's children into something approaching Legion-scale momentum once more. Official material already presents his sons as dispersed warbands driven by pride, sensation, and the need for his favor, while the Crucible War tests what they will sacrifice to be judged worthy by their Primarch. If one world's siege can function as both conquest and audition, then every victory under Fulgrim becomes more than territorial gain. It becomes a summons. It becomes proof that the center is forming again. In a legion starved for approbation and meaning, that is how splinters become a tide. The second bridge is the Imperium itself, because the Imperium does not process trauma by calming it. It processes trauma by multiplying violence until disorder resembles order again. A Fulgrim war would strike an empire already held together by faith, exhaustion, and bureaucratic cruelty, and his particular obscenity would hit every fault line at once. He is not merely another demon prince, nor another border horror in a galaxy overrun by horrors. He is one of the Emperor's sons returned as corruption wrapped in magnificence. That symbolic fact alone would provoke purges, crusading overreactions, theological convulsions, and administrative panic out of all proportion to the initial theater. This is where a war becomes bloodier than its opening campaign, because the Imperium begins killing in answer to what it fears the war means. The third bridge is chaos itself. Fulgrim's ascent is not automatically good news for the damned as a whole. The Emperor's children wage war through spectacle, prestige, sensation, and the public ranking of worth. And that style does not merely offend the Imperium. It invites resentment from rival traitor powers, whose own gods, grudges, and priorities have no reason to kneel before Slaaneshi theatre. A Fulgrim-centered war that draws immense notice, worship and resources toward the Third Legion could destabilize the very balance the Long War pretends to maintain. That means secondary fronts, sabotage, competitive atrocity, assassination, and campaigns launched from spite as much as strategy. This too remains theory, but it is theory grounded in how the official material frames both Fulgrim's renewed importance and the Emperor's children's manner of war. And this, more than the noise of any reveal cycle, is the real story. Not simply that there is a new miniature, not simply that the Emperor's children have been granted a codex and a spotlight, not simply that one black library novel has opened a gate. The real question is the one your uploaded notes keep circling with the right kind of gravity. What does this do to the age we are already in, to a setting defined less by clean victory than by fallout, administrative decline, shattered ideologies, useful fictions, and the old imperial talent for bludgeoning truth into myth? Your notes are strongest when they insist that the aftermath matters more than the applause line, that the survivors are less victors than administrators of decline, and that the real horror begins when institutions start building memorial language over wounds they cannot honestly explain. That is why the likely end state, if Fulgrim truly ignites this wider conflagration, is not some neat sequence of campaign map arrows and named crusades alone. It is ash and splendor together. It is false memorials rising above districts still stinking of chemical incense and liquefied marrow. It is screaming liturgies in worlds where the faithful cannot decide whether they are hearing prayer, panic, or sonic aftershock. It is shrine vaults broken open in the name of purity, cults blooming in the wake of terror and fascination alike, sectors ruined not only because they were conquered, but because they were forced to respond to impossible ideals with equal extremity. That is the form of Bloodiest that matters most in Warhammer. Not only the piling of bodies, but the bleeding out of doctrine, memory, and legitimacy until what survives must survive by ritualized self-deception. So what must be watched next? If this story is to be followed with any seriousness, rather than with the shallow greed of headline chasing. The first sign is the outcome of Crucible itself, because one world's fate will tell us whether Fulgrim's opening statement ended as demonstration, humiliation, or disappointment. The second sign is evidence of broader re-legionization, any clear indication that scattered warbands are no longer merely orbiting vanity in isolation, but beginning to move with common momentum beneath the Phoenicians' gaze. The third is the shape of the imperial answer, especially any named response from crusading chapters, high command, or the wider machinery of faith and censure. The fourth is any hint that the war is leaking into a broader sector-scale crisis, rather than remaining a contained theater of excess. Those are the fault lines that would transform present canon into the larger nightmare this chapter has argued for. And if all of that comes to pass, then the final image is already waiting for it, old as the Legion's first pride and foul as everything that followed. The Palatine Aquila was once the mark of rare honor, the Emperor's own sigil borne by the Third as proof that perfection, loyalty, and splendor could be made one. Official material still reminds us of that ancient privilege, even while presenting Fulgrim now as a grotesque magnificence, the Great Fall made flesh. Your own uploaded notes seize upon the image of the half-decaying Palatine Aquila as emblem, and rightly so, because nothing better captures what Fulgrim's return really is. Not merely a villain stepping back onto the stage, but perfection turned inside out, honor rotted into pageantry, a sacred emblem hanging in the dark as carrion heraldry. So the verdict stands. Yes, it could be the bloodiest war since the Heresy. Not because the official text has yet said those exact words, but because the structure for such a disaster is now visible, a returned Primarch active in the present. Age, a broken legion gathering around his notice, an Imperium that answers trauma by deepening it, and a Chaos Order unstable enough to tear at itself when one brother's vanity grows too bright to ignore. The Heresy taught the galaxy how brothers can destroy an empire. Fulgrim may now teach it how one brother can make that old wound split open again.